To order. We begin this afternoon with a new witness, Ambassador Tambs. Mr. Ambassador, would you stand, please, to be sworn? Raise your right hand.
Yes.
You swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give this committee is the truth and the whole truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. You may be seated.
Thank you.
Questioning of the ambassador will begin with Mr. Mark Belnick. Mr. Belnick, I might say to you that we may interrupt you in just a few minutes to take a vote on closing the sessions as soon as we have a quorum on our side. You may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Tambs. You were the United States Ambassador to Costa Rica from July 1985 through December 1986?
Yes, sir. Actually, until about the middle of January '87.
My questions this afternoon will pertain to that period of your service in the government, but before we begin, I'd like briefly to summarize the highlights of your career with you. You received your bachelor's degree at the University of California at Berkeley?
Yes, sir.
And a master's and PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. You served in the United States Army between 1945 and 1947, then again in 1950 and 1951. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Then, in the following period, you served with a company in Venezuela until you became an assistant professor of history at Creighton University.
That's correct, Mr. Belnick.
Thereafter, you were an assistant professor of history and an associate professor of history through 1982 at Arizona State University, during which time you were also the director of the Center for Latin American Studies.
Yes, sir.
You became a consultant to the National Security Council of the United States in 1982 and served in that capacity for a year.
Well, almost a year, sir.
Almost a year. And during that period, did you become acquainted at all with Oliver North?
Yes, sir. He was on the staff.
All right.
Mr. Ambassador, excuse me for interrupting. Would you pull that microphone very close to you?
I'd be happy to do so.
It's a voice-activated microphone, and it helps if you speak right into the microphone.
Thank you.
You were appointed the American ambassador to the nation of Colombia in 1983 and served there for 2 years until 1985. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I understand, sir, that during your tenure as ambassador to Colombia, one of your key missions, which you were given by Judge Clark, who was then National Security Advisor, was to do what you could to cut down on the narcotics trafficking from that area to the United States. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
And that you were asked to urge the government to take a stronger line with the narcotics traffickers, and you did that. And you were responsible, as I understand it, for substantially aiding the cut down of drug trafficking from that area at no small risk to your own life.
Yes, sir.
And because of your work against the narcotics traffickers in Colombia, you and your family have both been the recipient of threats against your life, including a bombing at the embassy residence in 1984.
That's correct.
And is it also true, sir, that during that period, Colonel North sent down certain members of the Delta Force to help protect you against the threats that were coming your way from the narcotics traffickers?
Yes, sir.
In 1985, as we said before, summer of 1985, you were appointed ambassador to Costa Rica. Correct?
Right.
Now, sir, in early July 1985, before you left to take up your new post as ambassador to Costa Rica, did you have a conversation with Colonel North in which he asked you to undertake a certain assignment in your new ambassadorial position?
That's correct.
Could you tell the committee what Colonel North asked you to do?
Colonel North asked me to go down and open up the southern front.
Was anybody else present in this conversation but you and Colonel North?
Not that I recall.
Where did the conversation take place?
It was in his office.
And what did you say to him?
What did I say to him?
Yes, sir.
Well, I don't recall my exact words, but I said, if that's what they want, that's what we'll try and do.
Now,
In effect.
I'm sorry.
I say, in effect, that's what I believe I said.
All right. Did he say anything more?
No.
What did you understand Colonel North to mean when he said, we want you to go down there and open the southern front?
Well, from my understanding we're not talking about a front, Mr. Belnick, in the sense you had in France in World War I. We're talking about some isolated resistance groups which would distract the Sandinista army from the area up around the Honduran border. And
what was your instruction to be? What were you supposed to do as you understood it from Colonel North to help open that southern front?
well, as I understood it, Mr. Belnick, first of all, was we would encourage the freedom fighters who were basically in Costa Rica to fight. And the war was in Nicaragua. The war was not in Costa Rica. And so that's what I understood what my instructions were.
So you understood this to mean that you were to encourage them, in effect, to open a military front inside Nicaragua?
Yes.
All right, sir.
There was sporadic engagements, but basically the idea was to get them deep inside of Nicaragua, or to encourage them to do so.
And that was your assignment from Colonel North?
As I understood it.
Yes, sir. Now, when Colonel North told you, and I think you used the term, we want you to open up a southern front, who did you understand the we to be?
It was my understanding that he was speaking for the RIG, the Restricted Interagency Group.
Would you describe what you mean by the Restricted Interagency Group, or the RIG?
Well, that particular RIG dealt specifically with Central America. It was chaired by Assistant Secretary. He had not been confirmed yet. Let me point that out. It would be chaired by an Assistant Secretary, assuming he had been confirmed, right? It would also include a member from the CIA Central American Task Force, and additionally a member of the National Security Council. In this case would be Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
All right. Now, the Assistant Secretary of State, then awaiting confirmation for Inter-American Affairs, was Elliot Abrams.
That's correct.
So when you refer to the RIG, you're talking about a restricted interagency group that was to be, during your tenure in Costa Rica, chaired by Assistant Secretary Abrams, correct?
Yes.
And the other members of which, as you understood it, were Oliver North, representing the National Security Council, correct?
Right.
And the chief of the CIA's Central American Task Force.
Correct.
And what did you understand was the function of this RIG?
It was my understanding that the function of this RIG was to carry out United States foreign policy in Central America.
Was it your understanding, sir, also, as you've testified before, that this RIG was supposed to help the freedom fighters against the Sandinista government?
Yes.
Now, you've referred to this RIG as being composed of 3 persons who we've identified. Who was it who informed you that there was this 3-member RIG?
Oh, I don't really recall. It was just general knowledge as far as I knew.
Did you ever receive a written instruction that there was a RIG composed just of Assistant Secretary Abrams, Colonel North, and the CIA representative?
No, I never did.
Did the Secretary of State ever tell you that?
No.
Did Assistant Secretary Abrams ever tell you that there was just a 3-person restricted interagency group that was running U.S. Central American policy?
Not to my knowledge, not to my, as far as I recall.
Yes, sir. Did Colonel North ever tell you that?
Yes, I believe he did.
On what occasion?
Well, I saw him a few times between, April or May and July of 1985. And on one of those occasions, if I recall correctly, is that he advised me of that.
What, as best you recall it, did he say?
Well, he noted that there was a RIG, that he was a member of it, and there were at least 2 other members. That was the only other people he ever mentioned.
Well, did he say this after the conversation in which he said, we want you to open a southern front?
No. No, this is something that was just about, I believe that if I recall correctly, that he had told me this earlier, and when Ollie told me that that was what they wished me to do, I assumed that that, in fact, was a RIG instruction.
But he didn't say specifically in that conversation
Not
from
that I
whence
recall.
the instruction was coming, right?
That, if I recall correctly, that's right.
All right, sir. Now, you knew that there was also, or that there was, a much larger restricted interagency group of between 12 and 15 members that was involved with Latin American policy. Isn't that right?
I'd heard that, but I didn't know, I was never informed specifically of the members who might belong to it.
In any event, in your mind or understanding, you distinguished the three-man rig from this larger restricted interagency
Yes,
group.
in my mind, I distinguished it from the other.
Okay, sir. Did you ever ask Mr. McFarland whether this three-person rig had responsibility for Central American policy?
No.
And you never discussed it either with Director Casey, did you, sir?
No. Is that
Did you have any conversation, Ambassador Tambs, with Elliott Abrams about this instruction to open a southern front before you left for Central America, for Costa Rica?
No, we had a conversation, but it did not include that particular item.
All right. Now, to go back, the instruction from North, as you've testified to it, was to open a military front against Nicaragua, the Sandinista government in the south, from Costa Rica, right?
Yes.
Now, sir, that's not a typical ambassadorial function, is it? Opening military fronts?
Well, you must understand that ambassadors have a very, very broad mission. One of them, of course, is to defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And you're undoubtedly aware that the second stanza of the Sandinista hymn opens with the phrase declaring that the United States is the enemy of humanity. So one might suspect they have a certain position regarding the United States.
Was this something that had been given to you as an instruction at the Foreign Service Institute, instruction on opening military fronts as an ambassador?
I never attended the Foreign Service Institute.
Had you received any training at the State Department or expectation that one of your assignments as an ambassador would be to help open military fronts?
Well, no, and I never received any instruction that I would ever have to deal with narco-terrorists either, as far as that goes.
That instruction in Colombia came from the National Security Advisor, correct?
Came from Judge Clark, right.
Who was then the National Security Advisor?
Yes, sir.
This instruction came from Oliver North, correct?
Yes. You're talking about the one on the Southern Front?
The Southern Front,
Right.
yes, sir. Didn't the instruction coming from North seem a bit odd to you?
Well, not really.
Why not?
Well, is that since I assumed that he was speaking for the rig, I didn't really see that particularly out of line.
Well, was there anything that caused you to question whether a member of the National Security Council staff had the authority to give a mission to a United States ambassador, let alone a mission to open a military front?
Well, may I put that in context?
Certainly.
Is that Mr. North was working for the National Security Council.
Yes,
and
sir.
obviously, my assumption was that any instruction he gave me came from, obviously, his superiors.
Did
All right?
you, I'm sorry, sir, were you finished?
Well, and consequently is that when I was given that, I assumed that, in effect, that was a order from his superior, right?
Well, did you ask him if your assumption was correct?
No, is that I'd known Ollie for some time. He was an honest man, and he's an honorable one, and I just believed, correctly so, as far as I'm concerned, that it came from his superiors.
But you never checked that assumption with him or with any of his superiors, the Secretary of State, the President, the National Security Advisor,
I certainly
right?
never asked the President or the Secretary of State, no.
And never asked the National Security Advisor, right?
I never asked him. I never had an opportunity to. Is that, Bud was very busy, and
Did you try to see him to ask him if North's instruction was authorized?
I had no reason whatsoever to do so.
You believed that the instruction was authorized.
That's correct.
All right, sir. And so you understood that Colonel North, when he said, we want you to open a southern front down in Nicaragua, that Colonel North was speaking for the administration.
Yes?
And you didn't question his instruction.
No.
All right, sir. So that you understood, as of July 1985, based on your conversation with Colonel North, that it was the administration's policy that United States officials, you in particular, ought to push and work for the opening of a southern military front against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, right?
Yes.
All right. Didn't you consider that this position was in some conflict with the Boland Amendment then in force?
They have a saying in the Foreign Service, is that when you take the king's shilling, you do the king's bidding.
What about, I'm sorry?
Is that, in my knowledge of the Boland Amendment, was very limited. It had been passed when I was ambassador in Colombia, and I've never read it. I hadn't read it then, obviously. And the assumption is, on my part, was that if this were instructions that had been cleared, obviously, with the legal counsel or White House staff, and that you can't really expect people in the field to be constitutional lawyers, because I think you can see what the implications would be, that if any officer in the field, be he in the Foreign Service or be he in the CIA or whatever, if he in effect is obliged to check with his own personal lawyer before he carries out an order given to him by a legitimate superior, that the entire government is going to come to immobilization and paralysis. You know, is that the people in the field who are trying to do a job are going, I think, in every case, or in most cases, to assume that orders from Washington are legal and legitimate. And I certainly do not want to see the United States government brought to paralysis while people are getting private legal counsel before they carry out orders from their legitimate superiors.
Sir, the State Department had a legal advisor's office in 1985, didn't it?
Well, I suppose they still have one in 1987.
Yes, sir, and they had one then. Did you go to the legal advisor's office and ask for guidance on what the Boland Amendment permitted and did not permit at that time?
No, I did not. No.
Did you approach
No.
the White House counsel on that subject?
No.
You did understand at the time, sir, that the Boland Amendment prohibited military assistance, direct or indirect, by the United States government to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters.
Well,
you understood that.
As it is my understanding of the Boland Amendment, it forbade the use of appropriated U.S. government funds to aid the freedom fighters. And any aid in opening the Southern Front would come from what we casually call private patriotic Americans. And obviously, neither I nor anyone in that mission, as far as I was concerned, was going to violate the law. But if private individuals were going to aid the freedom fighters, that certainly was their business.
Sir, you were an employee and official of the United States government as ambassador to Costa Rica, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the things you were asked to do, and that you did do, as you'll testify, was to help open a southern military front in Nicaragua, correct?
It's correct in the sense that I aided the private patriotic Americans. You know, neither I or any officer from that mission was involved in actually opening it up.
Did you meet with military leaders of the Contras?
No, I never did.
In fact, I believe you've testified that you strictly avoided meeting with such military leaders, correct?
That's correct.
Why was that?
Well, first of all, it would be unseemly. Secondly is that Costa Rica is a nation which has a long and very open democratic tradition in which they have given properly all sorts of openings for people of various political viewpoints to express themselves. Is that during the Somoza years, many of the refugees from Somoza's tyranny sought refuge in Costa Rica. They were allowed, in effect, to carry on political activities, and sometimes more. And so consequently, I did not wish to violate their tradition of openness, and so consequently, I talked to only political leaders.
Did you instruct any representative of the U.S. government in Costa Rica to meet with military leaders of the Contras?
Is that, first of all, I want to make it clear, Mr. Belnick,
Yes, sir.
that as ambassador in Costa Rica, I was responsible and am responsible for what occurred there. And the fact is that what occurred was that eventually, after querying on a couple of cases, is that the senior CIA representative in Costa Rica did, in effect, contact some of the military leaders. But he had, as far as I know, cleared it with his home office.
But, sir, didn't you tell the senior CIA representative in Costa Rica to meet with military leaders of the Contras because one of your missions as a government group in Costa Rica, as you put it, was to open a southern front? Isn't that right?
Our major objective down there was, first of all, was to aid the private patriotic Americans, okay? And the senior CIA representative in Costa Rica, whose nom de guerre is Tomas Castillo,
Yes.
did talk with some of the freedom fighter comandantes.
And you told him that he ought to be doing that, right?
Yes, indeed.
All right, sir.
He also received instructions from Washington to do so.
He told you that?
Yes, he did.
And you did not think it would violate the Costa Rican policy that you mentioned before of openness for a senior representative of the CIA to be meeting with Contra military leaders?
Well, let me put this in context, if I may, Mr. Belnick, is that in the summer of 1985, the Costa Rican government was very, very fearful. They were fearful of a Nicaraguan invasion. Is that they had had the incident up at Las Crucitas, in which 2 of the Costa Rican civil guardsmen had been killed and 4 or 5 others wounded by fire coming from across the River San Juan. They'd been killed by Sandinista hostile fire. Is that in addition, Sandinista push-pull aircraft were regularly violating Costa Rican airspace, and in one case it rocketed a couple of villages over on the east coast on the Caribbean. Additionally, Sandinista patrols were moving into Costa Rica frequently, that is 3 or 4 times a week, up to a distance of 13 to 15 kilometers. Moreover, there was knowledge that the Nicaraguans were considering a surgical strike against Costa Rica. So the Costa Ricans were, to put it mildly, somewhat on edge, and they should be. Costa Rica is a demilitarized nation. It only has 8,500 policemen. Most of them are what you and I would call good old boys. They only have about 1,000 people who are trained. And of course, by this time, is the Sandinistas had built up a standing army of 68,000. They had another 20,000 on active militia on active duty. They had over 110 T-54 and T-76 tanks. They had over 300 armored personnel carriers, over 100 pieces of heavy artillery, and at that time about 20 attack helicopters, so it's about 30 now. Costa Ricans, therefore, were, with good reason, uneasy about Nicaraguan intentions. And so I did not think it unseemly, and apparently some Costa Ricans did not think it unseemly, that one of our people would talk to the leaders of the freedom fighters.
By the time you left your post in Costa Rica, did you believe you had succeeded in opening the Southern Front?
Well, to a certain extent, yes.
And how had you achieved that? And to what extent?
Well, is that you must recall, if I may put this in context, that the Costa Ricans wished to get rid of the freedom fighters who were sitting in Costa Rica, right? In other words, that obviously the war, once again, is in Nicaragua. The war is not in Costa Rica, okay? And consequently is that they would be glad to see them move into Nicaragua rather than to continue to sit around the frontier between Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Now, if the freedom fighters are going to move into Nicaragua, obviously they have to be supplied. There are only 3 possible ways to supply them. You have ground, you have maritime, and you have air, right? Ground was out. Maritime was dubious. So consequently, if it would be possible to persuade the freedom fighters to move into Nicaragua, obviously they had to have some sort of logistical support, which would be provided by U.S. and other private organizations.
And did you negotiate with the Costa Rican government to make possible that type of logistical support?
Well, once again, may I put this in context?
Certainly.
The Costa Ricans were fearful of a Nicaraguan invasion. Now, the Costa Ricans depend upon their defense for an inter-American force, something out of the Organization of American States. Now, an inter-American force to the Costa Ricans means a platoon of Panamanians, a half a company of Venezuelans, and the 82nd Airborne. Now, the difficulty was that the only airfield on the only really feasible invasion route from the north of Nicaragua was exposed. And it could be taken in very, very quick time. So consequently, the Costa Ricans are interested in two things. First of all, getting the armed democratic resistance out of Costa Rica into Nicaragua, and also having an airfield by which an inter-American defense force could arrive and protect them from a possible invasion. So their job, of course, is to take care of Costa Rica. So consequently is that they were consequently interested in an airfield which could be used for reinforcement and resupply, basically by the U.S. Southern Command, should there be an invasion from the north.
Sir, did there come a time in the summer of 1985 when you were specifically asked to obtain the Costa Rican government's permission for the construction of an airfield at Santa Elena to be used in connection with resupply of the freedom fighters?
I was asked to approach the Costa Rican government in regards to the construction of an airfield by private hands for use by private facilities, right? And I did that.
Who asked you to do that?
That came, as far as I recall correctly, from north through Tomas Castillo.
And once again, you assumed that this request to you was authorized by the United States government?
Yes, indeed.
All right, sir. Now, did you conduct negotiations with the Costa Rican government for this airfield?
That's correct.
And can you tell me what those negotiations yielded?
The negotiations yielded an airfield which could be used for reinforcement and resupply if there were an invasion from Nicaragua. At the same time, the airfield would be used for refueling and for emergency purposes, a private aircraft which would be used to supply the Nicaraguan democratic resistance, which obviously would have to move inside Nicaragua to be resupplied then, right?
Did you agree also that the airstrip would be deeded to the Costa Rican government?
Yes.
All right, sir.
Mr. Belnick, may I interrupt you to just note that the vote is pending again in the House, and House members will have to excuse themselves for that vote. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, you've referred several times to the private parties or private patriotic Americans who were involved with this airstrip. Is the term private patriotic Americans, does that originate with you, sir?
No, that's Ollie's term. He liked that one.
That was a term you heard him use?
Yes.
Did he ever put names to the term private patriotic Americans as to who was in that group?
He did not in my presence.
But he did tell you that from time to time he was making speeches to raise funds on behalf of this private patriotic American group, did he not?
Oh, yes. It was in the press, too.
And he told you that?
Yes.
All right, sir. Now, were you told which private patriotic American company was going to be constructing the airfield at Santa Elena or Point West?
Not initially, no.
At any time?
Yes, eventually I came to learn it was the Udall Corporation.
Udall Corporation. And who told you it was the Udall Corporation?
Tomas Castillo.
And did Mr. Castillo tell you who the principal was or the principals were of the Udall Corporation, who owned it?
No, not. Eventually I learned some other names, but that came much later.
All right. What other names did you learn?
Well, once the construction, or really we should say the extension of existing airfield, right?
All right.
Was underway, I learned that the aircraft would be under, what's the name, General? What's the name of that general? Air Force. That guy who testified. Secord, that's it, right, yes. Huh?
Strike a familiar name.
Yes,
all right.
right.
General Secord.
Right.
Did you know General Secord at the time?
No, I've never met General Secord.
You learned from Castillo at some point that Secord was connected with Udall, and that he was running the planes, correct?
That's correct.
And you had an opinion about those planes,
In what sense?
that they were junk.
Oh, yes, they certainly seem to break down with frequency.
And I believe you've testified in the past that the name of Secord was one that used to be cursed from time to time because people thought he had bought a bunch of junk.
I think that is a mild way of putting it, yes.
All right, it was your way of putting it.
Yes,
So,
all right.
did you find out where the money financing the airstrip was coming from?
No, I had no idea of the sourcing.
You learned at some point about an entity known as Lake Resources, correct?
Well, I didn't really learn that until a couple of months ago.
Only a couple of
Yeah.
months ago. All right. You did know during the time, though, in 1985, when the airfield was being constructed, that funds were coming through banks located in Panama and the Cayman Islands, right? That's something you had heard.
Well, Panama, Udall was a company which was incorporated in Panama, right? I assume that there were banks in Panama. In regards to Cayman Islands, Ollie at one time told me he had an account over there for private funding.
That who had an account over there?
That the private fund, private donors or private fund foundations or funders, how do you want to phrase it, huh? Had an
Any
account
way he
in the
phrased
Cayman Islands, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
And did he tell you who controlled that account in the Cayman Islands?
No, he didn't.
Did you ever ask him why it was that the company building this was a Panamanian company using banks in the Cayman Islands?
Well, that's not an uncommon practice, you know. All of Exxon's tankers are registered in Panama. I mean, in the business world, Panama is used time and time again by companies, U.S. companies. Huh?
You understood this company, though, to be a private patriotic benefactor organization, right?
And how do you mean the term benefactor?
Well, I don't know. How did you understand it to be? Did you consider it to be a company that was building the airstrip for profit?
No, no.
Well, then did you ask anybody why it was a Panamanian company with money in the Cayman Islands?
No.
All right, sir. Now, did you meet, in connection with the construction of the airstrip, a gentleman who used the name Olmsted?
Yes. I met Olmsted, in fact, in 1986.
All right. And in what connection did you meet Mr. Olmsted?
Mr. Olmsted came down in 1986, I believe it was in April or May, right? Is that there was elections in Costa Rica in February of 86. A new administration was inaugurated on the 8th of May, 1986. And the new administration had certain reservations about the airfield of St. Helena. They wanted the agreement rephrased or renegotiated, if you wish. And it was at that time that I met Mr. Olmsted.
All right, sir. And what did you understand his role to be in connection with this airstrip?
Well, I assume, very frankly, that he was the lawyer for the Udall Corporation, because he was down there negotiating an agreement. Huh?
All right, sir. And you heard him referred to as One-Eyed Jack?
Yes,
And you met him?
and it was true.
He had one eye. All right. Did you ever find out if he also had a second name?
Well, I didn't know he had a second name.
As far as you knew, his name was Olmsted.
That's right.
All
And
right.
I assume your name is Belnick, right?
All right. It is. It is. but I haven't been asked to open a front. So,
Well, who should we ask?
Mr. Ambassador, we'll stop this. We'll be cut off. How was the site for the airfield picked?
How was it picked?
Yes, sir.
Well, I really don't have any idea how it was picked.
Well, was it supposed to be a secret airfield?
Well, yes.
Yeah. Could you see it if you flew in over Costa Rica on a commercial airline?
Yes, indeed you could, and I always was convinced that the Soviet satellites would pick it up immediately. But that really was not my business or my problem.
Who selected the secret airfield site that could be seen from commercial airliners?
Well, undoubtedly some... I don't have any idea, really.
All right, sir.
Huh?
Not one eye.
No, I don't.
You didn't think it was one of the smarter moves in connection with opening the southern front?
Well, I suppose they might have found a better location.
Yes, sir. All right. Did you understand that the land was purchased from an American named Joe Hamilton?
Yes, indeed.
All right. Did you ever speak to Assistant Secretary Abrams about the airstrip, the non-secret secret airstrip in Costa Rica?
Yes, is that we had a chief of missions meeting in Panama
When was that?
early in September of 1985. And there was a distinguished assemblage of personages, and the Assistant Secretary was there, as indeed the CIA chief of the Central American Task Force, the man from across the river. And during the course of the meeting, in private conversations, we touched upon the developments of St. Helena.
And do you remember what the discussion was, generally, that Elliot Abrams participated in?
Well, essentially that they were having difficulty getting the agreement. The hang-up was they couldn't get agreement with the private owners of the airstrip, and I think that's about as far as it went.
Did Assistant Secretary Abrams indicate whether he was by that point familiar with the fact that the airstrip was under construction?
I don't believe it was under construction by September.
Did he indicate familiarity with the project?
Yes.
Did he indicate familiarity with your instructions to negotiate with the Costa Rican government about the construction of that airfield?
Well, I assume that since he knew about the project, he was familiar with the instructions.
Well, did he tell you he was familiar with the instructions?
No, and I didn't ask him either.
All right, sir. And did you tell him what instructions you had received?
Well, if he knew about the airstrip, my assumption was that he knew about the instructions.
Sir, did you tell him what instructions you were operating
Not
under?
that I recall.
All right, sir. Now, were there other occasions when Assistant Secretary Abrams visited Central America, Costa Rica, in fact, when, to your knowledge, he raised the subject of the airstrip?
Yes, it was raised on a couple of occasions he was down there.
Do you recall an occasion in the late fall of 1985 when the Assistant Secretary was in Costa Rica being briefed by various embassy officers and other U.S. government personnel at which you were present? Do you recall that event?
Yes.
And can you tell us what you recall having happened at that briefing in connection with the airfield?
Well, Tomas Castillo was also present.
I think it's safe now. Okay.
And the Assistant Secretary began to talk about the airstrip as the people in the room were familiar with it. And the vast majority, that is, all of them with the exception of probably Castillo and myself, were not. And I thought that Castillo was going to have a cardiac arrest for a minute. So, because everything was on a need-to-know basis, right? And Mr. Abrams was then pulled aside by Tomas Castillo and advised of his possible indiscretion. Is that the incident you're referring to?
Mr. Ambassador, could you pull the mic
Sure.
towards you, please?
Mr. Belknap,
Yes.
may I interrupt? The Senate is in the process of voting at this time, so senators will have to excuse themselves. But Mr. Belknap, please continue.
Yes, sir. Now, Ambassador Tambs, you attempted to keep news and information concerning the airfield tightly controlled within the embassy as well. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes.
Aside from yourself and Mr. Castillo, was anybody else in the embassy familiar with the project?
Yes, the Deputy Chief of Mission.
All right. Was there anybody else aside from the DCM familiar
Well,
with the project?
very briefly, is that he actually was the defense attaché, but since the Costa Ricans don't like that title, we called him the political military advisor. That's Colonel John Lent. But he really was not in on the action. He's a very fine man, very trustworthy man, and he had spent 2 years in Nicaragua, and consequently I needed his advice and his appreciation of things. He was not a player, but he was there when I first talked to those gentlemen about the possibility of opening up a southern front.
Now, outside the embassy, among U.S. government officials, as far as you knew, Colonel North, of course, was aware of the project, right?
Right,
Assistant Secretary Abrams, right?
right,
The chief of the CIA's Central American Task Force, correct?
right.
And also, sir, did you have occasion to discuss the project with Director Casey?
Much later.
When was that, sir?
Well, I believe it was about the end of July 1986,
And where was that discussion?
across the river.
In D.C.?
Yes, sir.
And what was the discussion?
It was very general. Basically, we talked about the Reagan Doctrine, and we referred in passing to the southern front of Nicaragua and the airstrip. And the idea was, of course, that hopefully this would be the beginning of a reverse domino theory against the Soviets, which they, of course, have been pushing at us since 1917 or 1945, depending upon your historical perspective. Huh?
Was it your understanding, based on the discussion, sir, that Director Casey was already familiar with the Southern Front project and the airstrip project?
Yes.
Before you had spoken to him?
Well, I really can't say. You know, I assumed he did, but I didn't know. That's two different things.
It was
Knowing
your-
and assumption.
All right, it was your impression.
Yeah.
All right, sir.
But I mean, I did not have direct knowledge.
All right.
Okay.
Did you have occasion to discuss the airfield project with Admiral Poindexter after he became the National Security Advisor?
Yes.
And do you recall when that was?
Yes, is that I thought it was in early January 1986, but it may have been, you know, late or mid-December of 1985. Huh? But it was after it was in that time frame. That
Was it during-
after,
I'm sorry.
pardon me, go ahead.
Was it during the course of a visit by Admiral Poindexter to
Yes.
Central America?
Yes, it was after Admiral Poindexter replaced Bud McFarland as,
National Security Advisor.
that's correct, yes. Yeah.
What discussion did you have with Admiral Poindexter at that time about the airstrip and the Southern Front?
Well, is that Admiral Poindexter came down. He was accompanied by Oliver North, right, and some other officials. And basically his mission was to stop in the capitals of democratic Central America and to reassure the chiefs of state or whoever it was, but basically the message was that U.S. policy in Central America would continue the same under his stewardship as it had been under McFarland's. And he was only in Costa Rica, I suppose, an hour and a half, 2 hours maybe. And we had a meeting at one of the hotels, and we talked about this, and we also talked at that time with a Costa Rican official.
And what was the discussion concerning the airstrip?
Well, the status.
All right, sir. Was the airfield once constructed used, to your knowledge, by the Contras,
Well, is that
or on their behalf?
you can debate whether it was ever really completed or not. Is that in the sense that it seemed like it was not properly prepared for the rainy season. Let's put it that way, right? They seem to have great difficulties, you know, getting it finished.
Yes, sir. Well, was it used, as far as you know?
Yes, as far as I know.
How many occasions?
I really can't tell you.
But the strip was used on those occasions by planes that were involved through the private
It was
parties.
used by private planes to resupply the freedom fighters in southern Nicaragua.
You recall an event in June or July of 1986 when a plane got stuck in the mud at the
Well,
airstrip.
that's why I suggest
Yes,
to
sir.
you, Mr. Belnick, that perhaps the field was not completed, because they had at least, was it 3 or 4 aircraft eventually stuck in the mud there.
All right, sir. And do you recall that in the specific occasion that I'm referring to, June or July of 1986, the plane which had landed there and got stuck there was carrying military cargo?
It was, indeed it was.
All right, sir. What happened to that cargo, do you know?
What happened to the cargo?
Yes, sir.
Well, eventually it lifted out.
Did there come a time in the same period?
Well, may I also pause here a moment?
Yes, sir.
And that is that the agreement we had with the Costa Rican government was that the airfield would not be used either for storage of supplies or provisions, and that any aircraft landing there would have already completed its mission, and that is it would land empty, and it would be refueled. And so I was consequently somewhat surprised to find out that the aircraft was stuck in the mud. That's probably why it was stuck in the mud, because it was loaded, and I guess it was an emergency.
Were you surprised also to find out that it was carrying military cargo?
Well, it did not really. I never saw a manifest, but I did not certainly assume they were only dropping.
Government of Costa Rica?
Well, I believe I fumed around, but I don't recall calling Colonel North.
All right. Did you speak to Tomas Castillo about that?
Yes. You must understand one thing, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Belnick. We're dealing with American lives. And if American pilots, private American pilots, are on this aircraft and there is an emergency, obviously you must choose to, in my opinion, right, I would choose to save American lives rather than have the aircraft crash. And also, a downed aircraft in Costa Rica would certainly be a greater embarrassment than even one stuck in the mud.
All right, sir. Do you know if there were any other, to your knowledge, military cargoes that went through that airfield?
I really can't say.
You don't know one way or the other?
No.
All right, sir. Did there come a time, Ambassador Tambs, in the summer of 1986, June or July, when Colonel North told you that he wanted to sell this airstrip to the CIA?
That was later, Mr. Belnick. I think it was around September.
All right. What do you recall that Colonel North said to you?
Well, Colonel North at that time indicated to me that the freedom fighters were out of money. The $100 million had not come in yet. You had a situation where, people were literally starving. A number of them in the Southern Front had mountain leprosy. It was a bad show. And it was my understanding from Colonel North that he wanted to sell what he called, quote unquote, the assets, and give that money or somebody give the money to the armed democratic resistance so they could carry on.
You understood him to be referring to assets including the airstrip, but in addition to as well, correct?
Well, yes.
Assets located in other Central American countries?
I suppose so.
He wasn't specific?
No, but he quoted a figure of I think $5 million, and obviously the assets that I had heard about, Costa Rica, certainly did not approach that figure whatsoever. So I assumed it was other assets, whatever that might be.
So he was talking about hoping to raise $5 million or so from the sale of these assets to the CIA, correct?
That's correct.
Now, sir, you've told us that part of your agreement with the Costa Rican government regarding the airfield was that it would be deeded to Costa Rica, correct?
The airfield, yes.
The airfield.
Correct, yes.
Did you understand how Colonel North could sell the airstrip to the CIA if it was deeded to the Costa Rican government?
By that time, by, say, September of '86, is that we had been forbidden the use of it.
All right, sir.
And my query, of course, was, how could you sell something which you couldn't use?
What was his answer?
He didn't reply, if I recall, as I recall.
When were you instructed by the Costa Rican government to shut down the airstrip?
That was in late May, early June of 1986.
And you carried out that instruction?
I told Tomas Castillo to shut it down.
And it was shut down so far as you knew?
Yes.
All right, sir. Now, did there come a time in September of 1986 when you learned that there was going to be a press conference in Costa Rica concerning the airstrip?
Yes.
What did you learn on that occasion and from whom?
Well, I was on leave at that time. I was over in I think it was around the 5th, was it Friday the 5th? Of September over in Greenbrier in West Virginia. And I came back from dinner about midnight, and there was a call waiting for me. And I was ordered to call the White House switchboard. And actually I did. And it was Ollie. And he said that he had received word from the senior CIA representative in Costa Rica that the next morning the Minister of Public, well, I believe I fumed around, but I don't recall calling Colonel North. Well,
All right. Did you speak to Tomas Castillo about that?
yes, you must understand one thing, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Belnick. We're dealing with American lives. And if American pilots, private American pilots, are on this aircraft and there is an emergency, obviously you must choose to, in my opinion, right, I would choose to save American lives rather than have the aircraft crash. And also, a downed aircraft in Costa Rica would certainly be a greater embarrassment than even one stuck in the mud.
All right, sir. Do you know if there were any other, to your knowledge, military cargoes that went through that airfield?
I really can't say, Mr.
You don't know
Belnick.
one way or the other?
No.
All right, sir. Did there come a time, Ambassador Tambs, in the summer of 1986, June or July, when Colonel North told you that he wanted to sell this airstrip to the CIA?
That was later, Mr. Belnick. I think it was around September.
All right. What do you recall that Colonel North said to you?
Well, Colonel North at that time indicated to me that the freedom fighters were out of money. The $100 million had not come in yet. You had a situation where, people were literally starving. A number of them in the Southern Front had mountain leprosy. It was a bad show. And it was my understanding from Colonel North that he wanted to sell what he called, quote unquote, the assets, and give that money or somebody give the money to the armed democratic resistance so they could carry on.
You understood him to be referring to assets including the airstrip, but in addition to as well, correct?
Well, yes.
Assets located in other Central American countries?
I suppose so.
He wasn't specific?
No, but he quoted a figure of I think $5 million, and obviously the assets that I had heard about, Costa Rica, certainly did not approach that figure whatsoever. So I assumed it was other assets, whatever that might be.
So he was talking about hoping to raise $5 million or so from the sale of these assets to the CIA, correct?
That's correct.
Now, sir, you've told us that part of your agreement with the Costa Rican government regarding the airfield was that it would be deeded to Costa Rica, correct?
The airfield, yes.
The
that's
airfield.
correct, yes.
Did you understand how Colonel North could sell the airstrip to the CIA if it was deeded to the Costa Rican government?
By that time, by, say, September of '86, is that we had been forbidden the use of it.
All right, sir.
And my query, of course, was, how could you sell something which you couldn't use?
What was his answer?
He didn't reply, if I recall, as I recall.
When were you instructed by the Costa Rican government to shut down the airstrip?
That was in late May, early June of 1986.
And you carried out that instruction?
I told Tomas Castillo to shut it down.
And it was shut down so far as you knew?
Yes.
All right, sir. Now, did there come a time in September of 1986 when you learned that there was going to be a press conference in Costa Rica concerning the airstrip?
Yes.
What did you learn on that occasion and from whom?
Well, I was on leave at that time. I was over in, I think it was around the 5th, was it Friday the 5th? Of September over in Greenbrier in West Virginia. And I came back from dinner about midnight, and there was a call waiting for me. And I was ordered to call the White House switchboard. And actually I did. And it was Ollie. And he said that he had received word from the senior CIA representative in Costa Rica that the next morning the Minister of Public Security, Mr. Garone, was going to give a press conference relating to the airstrip at Santa Elena. and that he did not believe that this was a good idea.
Did Colonel North ask you to do anything?
Yes, he asked me to call the president, President Arias, and to see if we could dissuade him from this press conference.
And you made that call?
Yes, I eventually tracked him. There was a 2-hour time difference, so it was, midnight in West Virginia. That means it was about 10:30 in San Jose. He was at dinner.
Yes, sir.
They eat late there.
And when you called, you told the President of Costa Rica that you didn't think it would be prudent for such a press conference to take place, particularly in light of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice case that was then pending, right?
That's correct.
And he told you he would see what he could do about it, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then you received a call back from him saying that he had spoken to the relevant minister and that the press conference was not going to take place, right?
That's correct, yes.
You conveyed that information back to Colonel North and Assistant Secretary Abrams on a conference call, right?
That's correct, yes.
All right, sir, and the matter ended there as far as you were concerned.
Yes, because the next day I went on real leave.
Yes, sir. Now, to your knowledge, did Colonel North ever call the President of Costa Rica to talk about this press conference?
Not to my knowledge.
Do you have an opinion as to whether Colonel North made such a call?
I have an opinion, and the
What's that
opinion is
opinion?
I don't think that he did, but I don't really know.
You've
Okay?
seen references
Yes,
in the
I have.
Tower report
Yes,
to messages by Colonel North claiming that he did make such a call.
that's correct.
But it wasn't done to your knowledge, and in your view, it wouldn't have been done.
No, it's unseemly,
All right,
and,
sir.
and I don't, that's the only thing I can say, right?
Sir, you know General John Singlaub,
Yes, indeed, I do.
and you've known him for 10 years or so.
A number of years.
All right. He came to Costa Rica in the spring of 1986, and you saw him there, right?
That's correct, yes.
And you had a discussion with him about the Southern Front that you were assisting the opening of at the time, correct?
Well, is it, that's really not entirely accurate,
All right,
is it?
tell me what the
May I-
discussion was.
Is the General Singlaub came to Costa Rica and called the embassy and asked for the courtesy of the mission, right? And consequently, as an old friend, we invited him over, right? As you would indeed do to many distinguished visitors. And since he is a celebrity, naturally a lot of people in the mission wanted to talk to him. So Tomas Castillo and I sat down and gave him an unclassified briefing. We did not talk about the Southern Front in detail, did not talk about Santa Elena, any of that stuff. And we told him some of the problems which we saw in Costa Rica. Right?
Yes, sir.
And so that's the incident you're referring to, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Did you discuss also Aden Pastora?
We discussed Aden Pastor as we did the other forces down there.
All right. Did you tell General Singlaub on that occasion that, in your view, Commander Pastora could do more for the cause of the freedom fighters if he would begin to speak in public and speak out against the Sandinista regime?
Yes, he's a very attractive and charismatic figure.
By the way, sir, did the Department of State know that you would be meeting with General Singlaub about these matters?
Well, is that we didn't even know General Singlaub was in town. The fact is that it was just by chance that we got word that morning from another passenger who happened to be on the same aircraft as General Singlaub was, that he was in town. And then we had word that he had gone up to the San Juan River. And of course, one of the major missions that any ambassador or any foreign service officer has overseas is to report what's going on back to Washington. Now, as you're undoubtedly aware, a lot of times you report things they don't want to hear up here, but nevertheless you have to try and keep them in touch with reality by reporting what's going on. So when General Singlaub came in, I was glad to see him because I wanted to know what he was doing, very frankly. Huh?
And you saw him and did not speak to the State Department before you did?
No.
All right, sir.
No, is that we used to have clothing manufacturers and distinguished people who would come in all the time just as he did. And so it was nothing unusual. You know, the courtesy of the embassy is open to any United States citizen.
You did not speak to the State Department and advise them that you would be discussing the freedom fighters or Aden Pastora or assistance to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters with General Singlaub, right?
No. Huh?
All right, sir. Now, after you had your discussion with General Singlaub, did he contact you again and tell you that he had seen Commander Pastore?
Yes, he called me that afternoon and said that now let me make this clear to you.
Sure.
Is that, first of all, is that we had nothing to do with arranging any meeting. No one in the mission had anything to do with arranging a meeting between him and Comandante Cerro, Pastore, right?
Yes.
Is as far as we could ascertain, the meeting between General Singlaub and Eden Pastore had been set up prior to the general's departure from the States. Okay?
All right.
So in other words, that he was going to see him that afternoon, whether he had seen us that morning or not. All right?
Did you ask General Singlaub to come over to the embassy after he told you he had seen Commander Pastore?
No, I didn't.
Did you speak to him about his meeting with Commander
Yes,
Pastore?
he called up and said that he had seen Pastore. And since my mission was always to try and find out what's going on and
Yes,
tell
sir.
our friends up here in Washington, I said, why don't you come over for dinner? And I remember we had tacos that night.
Aside from the
Okay.
tacos, did he give you a copy of an agreement, that is, General Singlaub give you a copy of an agreement that he had entered into with Commander Pastore?
Yes, he
Would you
did.
turn in your exhibit book
Yes.
to Exhibit LAT-1, sir? And is that a copy of a cable that you sent to the Department of State for Assistant Secretary Abrams on March 27, 1986, setting forth, among other things, a copy of the agreement that General Singlaub had entered into with Commander Pastore?
Right. Well, I haven't seen this.
Would you take a look at it?
Because I do appreciate the chance to look at it.
Please.
Okay. Yes, he gave me a copy of an agreement that he, as a private individual, had made with Comandante Pastore, another private individual.
All right, sir. Now, the agreement provided as set forth in your cable, quote, the United States will provide boots, food, ammunition, medicine, maps, military needs for Pastore's troops, including new men who join his army, training advisors.
Yes.
Correct?
Then, and when I saw that, I said, you cannot negotiate for the United States government. He said, that does not mean the United States government. He said, that means we private United Statesians,
United Statesians?
That's right. That's a good
I see.
Spanish word, all right? And
He said, let me understand this, Ambassador. He said that United States didn't mean United States, it meant private citizens.
that's right. Because
That was his definition of United States.
I told her, I said this, I said, General, I said, you cannot negotiate an agreement in the name of the United States government. He said, it does not mean the United States government.
It only says United States. Sir, did you report in your cable?
Well, is it in the cable? Obviously, I have to send the text as given to me. You know, I can't change the text.
I understand, sir. Did you make comments at the end of this cable, LAT-1?
Well, the fact is that the comments were given verbally to the deputy, where's that damn thing? CIA representative in Costa Rica, right? And he took them down and sent it out, and I did not review the cable, right? May I read the comments?
Yes, sir. And let me read it because the copy is somewhat blurry. Ambassador's comments. In spite of written agreement, we have reservations that Pastore will comply. However, since Singlaub is envoy of Senator Helms and will report to him his observations and his own reservations upon return to Washington, Senator Helms may reevaluate his position regarding Pastore. Singlaub and his colleague Barbara Studley assured Ambassador, that Pastore agreed that all supplies, equipment, training, will be delivered provided via UNO, United Nicaraguan Opposition. Nothing will be delivered until Pastora's men are moved inside Nicaragua.
Well, I was reporting, not evaluating.
But that is the report you made concerning this agreement.
Yes, but that's a report. That's what you get paid to do.
All right. Now, sir, did you receive a quick response from the State Department to this cable? Would you look at Exhibit LAT number 2?
This is the,
which is a copy of a cable signed by Deputy Secretary Whitehead, but coming from and through Assistant Secretary Abrams to you, dated March 29, 1986.
yes?
You received this cable in which the Assistant Secretary and Deputy Secretary said, among other things, "I was astounded by the report of the agreement concluded between General Singlab and Aden Pastora. I failed to understand how you and the CIA representative could associate yourselves with an agreement which purports to commit the United States to provide military materiel and advisors in exchange for a series of undertakings on Pastora's part." Now, sir, did you understand from the text of the agreement how the State Department might have concluded that this was an agreement that purported to bind the United States of America?
Well, first of all, we did not associate ourselves with the agreement. We were reporting on an agreement between two private individuals.
All right, sir.
And is it, if you will go back, if I may, to, was it Exhibit 1?
Yes, sir.
And this is stated here. Right at the beginning. It's stated here twice, right? It's stated here. This memo is to acknowledge the agreement made this day between Major General John K. Singlab, USA retired, and Commander Aden Pastora. Well, obviously, Mr. Singlab was not a representative of the United States government. So I thought that perhaps the astounded cable could only mean they hadn't really read what we had sent up, because we were reporting.
Well, sir, would you look at the last paragraph of Exhibit LAT 2? You say it was your view they hadn't really read the cable. Did you think that it was unreasonable for a reasonable observer, as Deputy Secretary Whitehead put it, to conclude that there would be wrong impressions conveyed by your association or the embassy's association with an initiative by General Singlab that purported to speak in writing on behalf of the United States? Did you consider that an unreasonable impression to be created?
Would you repeat that question,
Well,
please?
look at the question which was put to you at the end of Exhibit 2. It says, "To a reasonable observer, what impressions would have been conveyed by your and the embassy's association with this initiative?"
Well, didn't
Whitehead.
if I may, I believe I answered that
Yes, sir,
in
in
a
LAT
subsequent
Exhibit
cable,
3.
right? Where's that? No. It's over here. If that's Exhibit what, sir? 3?
LAT Exhibit
All right,
3, yes, sir.
Paragraph 5.
Yes, sir.
And the answer is, to any reasonable observer, it would appear that since General Singlab, acting as a private individual, requested an interview with me, and since we wished to find out what was going on, this was entirely normal, given his involvement with a number of Nicaraguan resistance instrumentalities. Okay?
So you believe that Deputy Secretary Whitehead's and Assistant Secretary Abrams's reaction to your cable sending the agreement was not reasonable?
Well, whether it was reasonable or unreasonable is that the fact is that we sent up a reporting cable, and reasonable men can have different views of something. So it's not unusual.
Did you send up that reporting cable through a back channel,
Yes, indeed.
the CIA channel?
Yes.
Why did you send it up through a highly restricted secret channel?
Why did I send it up?
Yes, sir. Why didn't you send it up through the normal diplomatic channel?
Well, because we worked on a need-to-know basis, right?
Even with agreements between purely private individuals?
Well, is that we had all sorts of reporting which might go back channel, which was not really of great import, so there was nothing unusual about that.
It did not occur to you that despite disclaimers of U.S. government involvement, somebody might be able to use the text of that agreement to indicate that the United States, through the embassy, had committed itself to supplying military needs of Aden Pastora. That was not your view?
My view was that we should report to Washington what we had found out, and that's what we did.
Sir, would you look at LAT Exhibit 4, which is a cable that you then received from the Secretary of State, in which he told you that at his request, the State Department legal advisor had reviewed the legal issues raised by the agreement, and the Secretary continued, quote, based on his review, the legal advisor concludes that it is impossible to rule out the possibility that your disclaimers of U.S. government involvement notwithstanding, Pastora might attempt to use the Singlaub agreement to pressure or embarrass the United States government. You are therefore instructed to inform Pastora that Singlaub is not authorized to negotiate on behalf of the United States, that the United States government does not consider itself bound by Singlaub's agreement, and that U.S. government policy remains as stated to Pastora on March 7 by me, Secretary of State Schultz, and Assistant Secretary Abrams, etc. Did you disagree with that view?
In what sense?
That notwithstanding your disclaimers, it would be possible for reasonable observers to conclude that the United States government had associated itself with this agreement?
Well, Pastora had the agreement anyway.
Did you disagree with the view?
May I finish?
Yes, sir.
Is that we were reporting on an agreement made between two private individuals. It is our job to report. If we did not report, Pastora would still have the agreement, right?
But, sir, your report did not contain any disclaimer of U.S. government involvement, did it, Exhibit 1?
Well, if you look at Exhibit 1, it is my impression, and as once again reasonable men can disagree, right, is that it opens with an agreement between two private individuals, which is it, what else can you do? What else can you say?
Sir, did you carry out the instruction to inform Aden Pastora that the United States government did not consider itself bound? When did you so inform Commander Pastora?
Well, it turned out that he was, I believe, out of the country, wasn't it? Is that what we say in our reporting cable?
Yes, sir.
We made an effort to find him, but I think he'd gone to Washington.
Well, did you ever find him thereafter and convey the information that the United States government disclaimed that agreement?
Well, I wasn't going to talk to him anyway, because I never talked to him.
So you didn't speak to him about that?
No.
And did you speak to General Singlaub about that?
No.
All right, sir. Now, do you have an understanding of why, in light of the instructions you believed you had been receiving theretofore from the rig about the Southern Front and the airfield, why it was that the Department of State reacted as it did, Assistant Secretary of Abrams included, to your transmission of this report about the agreement involving Singlaub and Pastora? Do you know why they reacted so vehemently against it?
No, I have no idea.
All right, sir. And you never discussed that with them?
No.
Now, sir,
Mr. Beldick, may I interrupt again simply to notify members of the House a vote is pending on final passage of the Older Americans Act. You may proceed, sir.
I just have several more questions, Mr. Chairman. Sir, how did you communicate with the rig in Washington about your activities generally, regarding the airstrip, regarding the opening of the Southern Front, regarding the carrying out of your mission as you understood it?
My contacts were very limited, Mr. Belnick, is that I recall sending maybe 2 or 3 cables in 18 months, limited number of phone calls, is that in general, is that Mr. Castillo was the channel, which went back to the rig.
Did anyone from the State Department instruct you that Mr. Castillo was to be your channel back to the rig?
No.
And the channel, as you used it, as I understand it, sir, was that you would convey information to Tomas Castillo and assume that he was channeling it back through CIA channels to the rig, correct?
Yes, and that was confirmed on numerous occasions, because obviously if the other 2 members of the rig, 3 members if you wish, were abreast of developments, obviously the information was leading them. Let me explain to you how an embassy works, is that most embassies have 2 communication systems, all right? They have basically a State Department communication system, which includes, commerce and you name it, right? And then it has a CIA station transmission system.
All right.
And you're probably aware that distribution of messages through state channels can only be described as generous. And since we were operating on a need-to-know basis, we believed it prudent to use the CIA channels.
All right, sir. Do you know of any occasion when Mr. Castillo spoke to Assistant Secretary Abrams, to your knowledge?
You mean over the phone or something?
Yes,
No.
about any of these matters? No. Did you ever see any cables from Mr. Castillo back to the rig?
Is that they
Concerning the freedom fighters?
No, is that the CIA does not show you the originals.
Did you see any copies?
Is that, wait a minute, originals or original copies. Is that what you get is a sanitized version with all sorts of things sort of like this cut out, and that's what, you read, okay?
All right, sir. Did you ever appear at any rig meetings?
No.
Did you ever receive any written instructions from the rig concerning the freedom fighters?
No.
All right, sir.
Sorry.
Now, you resigned from your post in January of 1987?
Is that... No, I actually resigned, I sent in my resignation early in December of 1986.
And as I understand it, that resignation had nothing to do with the controversy that had developed and led to these hearings.
That's correct, Mr. Balnick. In July of 1986 is that I wrote the president of Arizona State University, J. Russell Nelson, telling him that as we had previously agreed, I would return to full-time teaching in the spring of 1987.
And when you announced your resignation to the staff in December of 1986, you said in substance that you believed you had accomplished the mission involving the opening of the Southern Front that you had been sent down to accomplish.
Yes.
All right, sir. And you're currently back at Arizona State as a full professor specializing in Latin American
That's
history.
correct, yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr.
You're
Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bellin.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a few questions, Ambassador Tambs. Ambassador Tambs, were you ever aware of C-7 aircraft that belonged to this private resupply group obtaining permission to land at the international airport in
C-7?
C-7 or any other aircraft belonging to the...
Is that a Caribou?
That is a Caribou.
Yeah, yeah. Belonging to,
This private group.
yes?
What do you know in that regard? Did you, were you asked to obtain permission of the Costa Rican government for these, for the refueling to occur?
These aircraft were, this was when, July or August?
That would be from the approximately in June through July of 1986.
In other words, this was after the, I'm sorry, thanks. This was after the Santa Elena airstrip had been shut down?
Correct, sir.
Yeah. Yes, is that at least on one occasion and possibly on two, I was advised that an aircraft would have to land because it did not have sufficient fuel to return to base, all right? And at that time, I asked two of my officers, this is very early in the morning, to make certain the aircraft was refueled and gotten out of there as quickly as possible.
You said that you were advised of this. Who advised you?
Tomas Castillo.
And did you seek to obtain the permission of the government?
No.
Well, how could the aircraft land without permission?
Well, it just landed, was refueled, and it took off.
It didn't have to be cleared by the officials at the airport, at the international airport?
Well, I understand it was cleared by the officials at the airport. If you want, but you're talking about me talking to somebody, no.
Do you know
but
how
my
it was
officers
cleared?
were acting under my instructions, and I'm responsible. I want you to make that clear. Here again, you have a choice. You have American pilots whose lives are at stake, and at the same time, you have people dying in the swamps and jungles of southern Nicaragua, and are you going to abandon them?
Well, Ambassador Tambs, let me ask this question. Did you ever receive any communications from Colonel North asking you to obtain Costa Rican government approval for refueling at the international airport?
No. It may have, not that I never had any direct communication with North on that at all.
Do you know whether anyone, Mr. Castillo or anyone else, referred you to those kind of communications from North on refueling flights?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Would you repeat that?
Did anyone else, to your knowledge, have that kind of communication that was in turn relayed to you?
Did anyone else have that kind of information?
Yes, specifically Mr. Castillo, Thomas Castillo.
Well, he was the one who advised me of the aircraft.
Right. Did he tell you whether or not he had spoken to Colonel North?
Not that I recall.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Mr. Van Cleve?
No question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ambassador Tambs, I believe in your testimony you indicated that the major objective of your assignment in Costa Rica was to assist patriotic Americans in aiding the freedom fighters. Is that correct?
Well, that was one of my tasks. Obviously, I had other things to do, Senator, is that, you know, I'd like to make it clear that the best guarantee of a continued prosperous and democratic Costa Rica is a prosperous and democratic Nicaragua. And consequently, since I have been in and out of Costa Rica since about 1957, I believe very sincerely that by aiding the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, we would in effect buttress Costa Rican democracy. And of course, one reason that they were amenable to an airstrip was their consistent and persistent, perhaps better said, and I think very real fear of an invasion from their Goliath to the north, which in that case is Nicaragua.
I have before me a letter dated August 14, 1985, from the Secretary of State to you on the eve of your assignment as Chief of Mission in San Jose. This is his letter to you. It's marked secret. And this letter has no reference to giving assistance to the Contras.
I believe, sir, that I was already in Costa Rica at that time.
Wasn't it strange that the Secretary of State would not mention the importance of the Contra in this letter, his first official letter to you?
Frankly, it would have seemed more strange if he had mentioned it.
I see. In response to a question relating to the Boland Amendment, in which you indicated that you weren't quite certain as to the legal implications, you said, "One who takes the king's shilling does the king's bidding."
Yes, sir.
Who is the king?
Well, I would assume it would be the United States government.
the President of the United States?
Well, you could carry it to that, I suppose.
Now, Mr. Belnick showed you Exhibit 4, I believe, in which the State Department, the Secretary of State specifically, expressed his concern over your relationship with General Singlaub and said the following: "You are therefore instructed to inform Pastora that Singlaub is not authorized to negotiate on behalf of the United States, that the United States government does not consider itself bound by Singlaub's agreement, and that the United States government policy remains as stated to Pastora on March 7th by me." Did you notify Mr. Pastora?
Upon receipt of this cable, sir, we searched for Mr. Pastora, and he was out of the country, right? It's my understanding that the officer who was directed to tell him finally did catch up with them, but I won't swear to that, okay? It was his instructions to do so, though.
Did you notify General Singlaub?
No, does it say that here? My reading of the cable at that time, sir, was that I was supposed to send somebody to talk to Mr. Pastora. Certainly General Singlaub had departed Costa Rica, and he was back in the United States.
When you saw Mr. Pastora in Washington in July, did you carry out your instructions?
I met Mr. Pastora in July of 1985 prior to my departure to Costa Rica, sir.
It bothers me, Mr. Ambassador, that we find ourselves on the 200th anniversary of our Constitution in having private citizens conducting a war in the name of the United States and private citizens entering into agreements in the name of the United States. Does that concern you?
Well, sir, is that I called that to General Singlaub's attention when he gave me a copy of the agreement and pointed out to him that he was not the United States government, and he agreed. Now, on the other hand, is that you remember Cordell Hull, when he talked about United States foreign policy, he said, first of all, is that U.S. foreign policy must be in the interest of the United States. And secondly, it must be a consistent foreign policy. So a reasonable person could assume that perhaps General Singlaub was attempting to be consistent. That is, in aiding the Nicaraguan armed democratic resistance. And after all, there are groups, as you know, sir, who are aiding the Sandinista government from the United States. So there appear to be people on both sides.
So as long as you believe that it is in the best interest of the United States, you are free to carry out what you consider to be the foreign policy of the United States?
No, sir, I'm not suggesting that whatsoever. Is that obviously we are bound by the laws in the Constitution. But once again, is that the cable of this agreement between these two private individuals, excuse me, was a reporting cable. And it's our duty or our job to tell Washington what's going on. Obviously,
You got your marching orders on the opening of the Southern Front from Colonel North.
Yes, sir.
You did not get this direction from the Secretary of State.
No, sir.
You were also instructed by the Assistant Secretary, Mr. Abrams, to effectuate the carrying out of the Second Front.
is that the Assistant Secretary was abreast of all the developments when I saw him on various occasions. And I assumed, consequently, that he and the other members of the DRIG were directing this. This was confirmed as late as September 1986, when we had another Chief of Missions meeting at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, in which the three members of the RIG, as well as other people, were present when the the chief of the CIA Central American Task Force gave a presentation in which we reviewed the entire situation in the presence of some 30 to 35 people.
If the Secretary of State had instructed you to cease and desist in carrying out the second front, would you have listened to his orders or that of Colonel North?
Well, obviously with the Secretary of State.
But you didn't consider this message from the Secretary to be important enough to pursue Pastora, did you? And
Well,
to this day, you're not
sir,
aware.
I did not talk in Costa Rica to any of the military commanders. I instructed an officer to advise Eden Pastora of the Secretary's position. Eden Pastora was not in the country. I requested the officer to pursue him and tell him when he returned. But since, if I recall correctly, sir, Mr. Pastora was going over to state anyway, one could assume that they would tell him. Because if I recall correctly, he was coming up here to Washington to see people at the State Department.
So you did not respond to the Secretary as he directed you. He says, please report when this has been done, together with Pastora's response.
Well, wasn't there another cable, sir, saying that we had pursued him, but he was out of the country? Here it is, sir. That is, here is my response, if you would care to look at it. It's doesn't have a number on it.
Exhibit 5.
And here it is. That is what? Number 5, sir?
Is that your report to Secretary Schultz?
Yes. That is a reference back to the cable proceeding, right? Doesn't it have a ref-tel on it? Well, there it is, yeah. So we did report back, as you can see, sir.
You did report back to say that you were not able to meet with Pastora.
Yes.
One, I still have time here. Would you be surprised if you were told that Secretary Abrams testified that he was not aware of the construction of the airstrip before it was started?
Well, I can't speak for Secretary of State Abrams. I would be somewhat surprised, but
Is his memory failing him?
well, he might have been distracted. I don't know what context that he possibly received the information or whatever, and really only he can speak for himself. I can't speak for him.
In fact, he has testified that he does not recall discussing this assignment with you at the September 85 Central American Chiefs of Mission Conference.
Could you repeat that question, Senator?
Secretary Abrams has testified that he does not recall discussing this assignment with Ambassador Tambs during the September 1985 Central American Chiefs of Mission Conference.
I did not know, sir, that he testified that.
But you are convinced that at that time he did discuss it with you as you've testified?
Yes, sir.
On this press conference that was considered by the Costa Rican government to possibly expose the existence of this airstrip, you did call the President of Costa Rica?
That's correct, sir.
In receiving your instructions from Colonel North, did Colonel North provide you with any limits as to what you could do to get the Costa Rican government to do your bidding?
No, he indicated that it was counterproductive, and he asked me to talk to the President, and so I did.
Was any quid pro quo provided or any threat
No,
or suggestion?
no, sir.
The President was just amenable?
Yeah, he's a very decent man. Huh?
Where do you think your orders were coming from when you received direction from Colonel North?
I believe that they, and still do, sir, believe they were coming from the rig.
And where did the rig get its orders from?
That I can't say, sir.
You are a professor of diplomatic relations.
Well, I do teach the course, but my main specialty, sir, is in Latin American history. Inter-American relations. I have taught that course, sir. Yeah.
Do you believe that decisions of this stature and nature can originate and be implemented by a second-level bureaucrat?
Well, is that, there is a hierarchy in this world, right? And I don't believe they could, but that would only be speculation on my part, right?
Didn't it seem rather strange to you that a lieutenant colonel can tell you, an ambassador, who under any code of protocol would outrank him, tell you what to do?
Well, I assume he was speaking for people in high authority. That's all I can tell you.
And you were convinced that everything you did was in the interest of the United States?
That's correct, sir.
And you were convinced that every action taken was legal?
Yes, sir.
And that it did come from high authority?
Yes, sir.
I thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, sir.
Now, before proceeding to the next questioner, I want to observe that after this witness, we will be taking the testimony of a senior CIA official in Central America who was a covert operative. The testimony will be taken in executive session solely to protect his identity and that of his family. The transcript of his testimony will be declassified and released to the public within 24 hours of the time his testimony is completed. I will entertain a motion from Mr. Cheney, the ranking minority member of the House Committee, regarding conducting that hearing in closed session.
Mr. Chairman, in light of the sensitive nature of the material to be discussed, I move the committee meet in executive session.
Mr. Chairman.
Since the hearing on the CIA witness will be a joint one by the House and Senate Select Committees, I offer a motion to the Senate Select Committee that its hearings on this witness be closed.
Mr. Chairman, I second the motion of Chairman Inouye.
We have then before us a House motion and a Senate motion to close the hearings. Is there discussion from either House or Senate members? Hearing none, the question for the House members is on the House motion to close the hearing on the CIA witness. After that, the Senate committee will decide its motion. The clerk will call the roll of the House members. Aye.
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 Mr. Stokes. Aye. Mr. Ashton. Mr. Boland. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Cheney.
Aye.
Mr. Broomfield.
Aye.
Mr. Hyde.
Aye.
Mr. Porter.
Aye.
Mr. McCullum.
Aye.
Mr. DeWine. The ayes are 12 and the noes are 0.
And the motion to close the hearing is carried. Mr. Chairman?
The question is now on the motion to close the hearing of the Senate Select Committee on the CIA witness, and the clerk will call the roll.
None. Mr. Sarbanes. Aye. Mr. Heflin.
Aye.
Mr. Boren. Aye. Mr. McClure.
Aye.
Mr. Hatch.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Tribble.
Aye.
Mr. Redmond.
Aye.
Mr. Inouye.
Aye. The motion is carried.
We'll continue with the questions to the ambassador with Mr. DeWine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, let me start by asking you maybe a broad question. You are a specialist in Latin American affairs. This is what you teach. In fact, you just told us that you teach history, the history of the area. You've also served as an ambassador to Colombia. You've served as our ambassador to Costa Rica at a very crucial period of time. Can you tell us why a little country of under 3 million people like Nicaragua should be considered to be posing a threat to the other democracies of the region? It's very difficult, frankly, for some of our constituents to understand that, why some of us are concerned about that. What is the threat that you see?
Well, obviously, the United States is larger than Nicaragua, right? And you hear many times of the David and Goliath thesis, right? And if you want to really look at the David and Goliath thesis in the context of Central America, the Goliath is Nicaragua compared to its neighbors. Right?
Why is that?
Well, is that earlier I gave you some of the weaponry that they have required, which is all out of proportion to what the region has ever had before. But additionally, I think there's something which we might touch upon, and that is that in my view, the Soviets have three major strategic moves underway. One is to surround geographically the People's Republic of China. Vietnam is part of that. Two, it's to prevent or to deny the West, industrialized nations, access to oil and ore, which means the Middle East and Southern Africa. And third is to isolate the United States from its friends and allies and trading partners in Latin America. Now, ever since the Spanish-American War, the United States has really not been obliged to divert massive forces of men, material, or money southward. In effect, our ability to project power eastward across the Atlantic to the Western Europe and the Middle East, and westward across the Pacific to Asia, depends upon a cooperative Caribbean and a supportive South America, and we've had that. To a great extent, our southern frontier is, of course, our soft underbelly. Now, the Sandinistas are dedicated to exporting revolutions, one of their slogans. And one of the problems, of course, is that with communist totalitarianism, aside from subversion and penetration, which is going on in Honduras and El Salvador, is that there are massive flows of innocent people, refugees. Costa Rica faces this problem. Costa Rica only has 2.5 million citizens, and it has between 120,000 and 250,000 Nicaraguan refugees, which is destabilizing the country. Now, when the communists take over, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the people usually leave. And obviously, as the Sandinistas export revolution, as they say they're going to, revolution without frontiers, revolution sin fronteras, is that people will be affected in the rest of Central America and perhaps even Mexico. And we have a possibility of the destabilization of the entire region, which is going to have, of course, effects here in the United States. We tend to forget that San Antonio, Texas, is closer to Nicaragua than it is to Washington. And we in the West are perhaps somewhat more cognizant of geography than others.
Mr. Ambassador, very briefly, because my time is limited, could you tell us, during the time that you are ambassador to Costa Rica, what the attitude was by the Costa Ricans about the threat from Nicaragua?
The Costa Ricans...
Costa Rica with virtually what, no military at all,
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, the Costa Ricans, as you know, supported the Sandinista revolution. They virtually gave up their national sovereignty over the entire northern frontier. Some 37 Cuban aircraft landed in Llano Grande, the airfield in the west, laden with weapons for the Sandinista revolution. And the Costa Ricans believed, as many of us did, that the Sandinista revolution would be one of center-left, social democrats, Christian democrats. And the tragedy is, of course, is that it's a revolution betrayed. And the Costa Ricans feel betrayed more than anyone else because they supported the Sandinista revolution against the tyranny of Somoza. And they fear, with good reason, destabilization from Nicaragua. There are some 5 terrorist groups, communist-based, in Costa Rica, who receive training and funds from Nicaragua. But additionally is that what Costa Rica needs is investment and productivity. And as long as you have a Marxist-Leninist totalitarian regime in Nicaragua, money and technology, which the country needs, is not going to come. And that is one of the great tragedies in the long pull.
Mr. Ambassador, let me change the subject for a moment. I know you've been questioned about the Boland Amendment. I don't want to replow that same ground. You have made your opinion about it, and it's what you consider its applicability, and your contact with it, I think, very clear in your testimony. But I want to make sure that we leave these hearings with the essential facts, so that we have the facts pinned down. And I guess we're all going to be arguing about what the Boland Amendment really means for a long period of time, and I suppose ultimately the courts are going to decide. But I want to make sure we have the facts. It is my understanding that there were no appropriated government funds used for the construction of this airstrip. Is that correct?
To my knowledge, it was all private funds.
The materials were not in any way paid for by the U.S. government?
No, sir, not to my knowledge.
The laborers who were out there, whoever actually did the physical work, they were not paid for in any way, to your knowledge, by the U.S. government?
No, sir. No, that's correct. Pardon.
How many people in your embassy, just give me the number, actually knew this was going on as the construction was taking place?
As the construction took place?
As it was taking place?
Probably about 4.
About 4. Now, there has been one theory that has been put forward that anybody who is on government payroll, that their salary is attributable to time they spent maybe on this airstrip, and therefore there was a violation of the Boland Amendment.
Well, they weren't out
because
there,
of that.
you know, driving a bulldozer. Huh?
All right. I didn't figure they were, but let me just take this to its ultimate extreme. Would you have any idea how many hours you spent in regard to negotiations about this airstrip, or what portion of your total time that you were working you spent on that?
Well, I really didn't negotiate for the airstrip. And
you had some contact
yes,
with the government.
So what are we talking about? Maybe 40 minutes? Huh? maybe an hour and 40 minutes. You know, we're not talking, you know.
All right. You had some discussion, I assume, in the embassy with these 3 other people, so maybe we can attribute some time to that, too, I assume. Would that be correct?
Well, yes, I
All right.
suppose.
So you got some time in it, but would it amount to more than 2% of your time that year?
Well, no, and considering the fact that I was on a 60 to 80 hour a week, the time is really even less. If you want to give my first 40 hours strictly to the government, then I was doing it on my own time.
Let me move to another area, Mr. Ambassador. I want to clarify some things, and you have been through this, but I want to make sure I understand it. You testified that before you went to Central America, before you assumed your position as ambassador in Costa Rica, that you talked to Ollie North, and you quote him as saying that we want you to open up a southern front. Was there anybody else that you talked to prior to going down there who told you or gave you any kind of instructions about opening a southern front? Is there anybody else in the U.S. government that you can recall?
No, not that I recall. Briefly, I met the chairman of the CIA Central American Task Force. Okay, and we touched peripherally on this.
But no instructions from him about that?
No.
All right.
It was obvious that he knew what had been discussed, if you wish to put it
All
that
right,
way.
but I want to make sure this is important. We get exactly what the facts are as far as the discussion, and we are not in a court of law, and we don't have the hearsay rule, but you and I, for the next 5 minutes, are going to pretend like we do have a hearsay rule, if that's all right with you, Mr. Ambassador. We're going to talk about exactly what you heard, and you've been very plain and very open so far with us, and I appreciate that. I just want to go through it again and make sure I fully understand it. You had a conversation with Elliot Abrams in Panama, at this Panama meeting, I believe. Is that correct? Was that the first time that any discussion had taken place between you and Mr. Abrams in regard to this airstrip or southern front?
That's correct.
All right. And how long did that conversation last? Do you have any idea?
Is that, what, 3 minutes?
All right.
4?
My understanding is it was in the hallway.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. It was just en passant.
At that time, did he give you any specific instructions about what to do in regard to the southern front or in regard to the airstrip?
No, he didn't give me tell me anything not to do either.
All right.
As far as
You
that
knew
goes.
what, you knew that, you got the impression he knew what was going on, but there's no instructions. Is that my
That's
understanding?
correct, yes.
All right. Did he at any time give you any instructions about that later on?
Well, no, on a couple of times.
Specific order, something that you would follow?
No.
Either way.
No. Is
Okay.
it on one occasion, I know, or at least two, he expressed his concern about the reluctance of the new government.
All right. And
But
what
that's-
point in time
I
would
would
that-
not say that was an instruction. No?
All right. Anybody else in the United States government, with the exception of Mr. North and with the exception of the CIA station chief down there, did you get instructions from anybody else about this airstrip?
No. I discussed it, as I testified earlier, with Mr. Casey.
All right. Now,
But he's not giving me instructions.
he's not giving you
No.
instruction. That is at some later date, I believe. you
Yes,
testified.
right.
I want to make sure I understand. Is it my understanding, Mr. Ambassador, that your contact in regard to this whole operation was primarily with your CIA station chief? Is that a fair statement or not?
Yes, in general, that's correct.
All right. You also had some contact with Ollie North. Is that correct?
Yes, very peripheral, yes.
Peripheral with Ollie North. Now, you have testified that you assumed that the instructions were coming from the rig. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
But as far as your direct contact, I want to keep it to that. As far as your direct contact, that contact was coming from the CIA station chief. He's the person you dealt with on a daily basis. You would give a message to, or he would give you a message back. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not saying we saw each other every day.
Okay.
We might see each other once a week and then see each other 2 times a day. But is that if you recall, I noted today that in September of 1986, when we had the Chief of Missions meeting in Homestead Air Force Base, all of the principals of the rig were there. And, is that the chairman of the CIA Central American Task Force went through the entire situation in Central America, including the airfield and the Southern Front.
And what date was that, Mr. Ambassador?
What date was that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed it. You said it, but
Well, it was, I believe it was about the middle of September of 1986.
of '86.
Yes, sir.
And
Right.
you assumed your duties in Costa Rica when?
In July of 1985. No. What I'm suggesting to you, sir, is that everything which we had tried to do or had done was well known to what I considered to be the principles of the rig.
I appreciate that, and
Yes.
you've been very clear on that. What I'm trying to do is just, again, define who you were dealing with. And, we're putting this story together, and we're putting one piece of the puzzle at a time, and we'll get to the rest of it, because a lot of these witnesses are going to come, and they'll be testifying as well. Mr. Ambassador, it is my understanding, and I just want to bring this out because I'm not sure it was totally clear in your earlier testimony. Your work in Colombia was frankly very extraordinary. It is not the type thing we usually associate with U.S. ambassadors, but it was your instruction that you received from Judge Clark. You went down there. Your life was threatened. Your family had to be evacuated. You hung in there and you stayed down there. It's my understanding your family was actually taken to a base up somewhere in North America to get out of there.
Yes, in the winter, too.
All right, far north, as I recall. It's also my understanding that 3 names were left at, I believe, an airfield of people who were going to be killed, and 2 of those were killed, and your name was one of the 3. So it was a tough time down there, and your service down there, I think, is very commendable, and we certainly appreciate it very much. Let me ask a final question, Mr. Ambassador. In your dealings with Costa Rica, what was their attitude, and if you know the attitude of other Central American countries, about commitments from the United States? Do they have faith in our commitments? Do they worry about them? What can you shed any light on that?
I think that's a very important question, because the major fear among the Central Americans, I can only speak firsthand for Costa Rica, is that the United States is going to get them out front and then abandon them and cut its own deal with the Sandinista government. Now, the Costa Ricans are very well-educated and sophisticated people, and they don't, when they talk about the allies that the United States has abandoned, they don't start with the Baltic republics and the Poles and the Romanians in 1945. The Costa Ricans will start with the Armenians in 1919. And they, in effect, have somewhat less than full faith in the United States' will and stamina to its commitments to defend democracy in Central America. It's one of our major problems.
All right. My time is up, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much.
Mr. Redmond, Senator Redmond.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I will not use the 15 minutes, so whoever else is in line, I want to just advise them. I expect we'll use a great deal less than that. Ambassador Tambs, it's nice to see you again.
Thank you.
You've been a very candid witness, very refreshing. You're a private citizen, came into government service in, what, 82?
Yes, sir.
And in for about 4 or 5 years and out again. Back to your former pursuits. You have taken full accountability for what you did. You let it stand out there. You don't run and hide. And you've been very candid. And I don't have a lot to ask you. I was kind of interested in your interview in the New York Times on the 3rd of May, because it's quite a contrast, not to your testimony here today, but to what I guess you stand for. Let me just recount just a few bits of that to you verbatim. It was a great story, Mr. Ambassador. I enjoyed it, so I saved it knowing that you'd be here. It was by Joel Brinkley in the New York Times on the 3rd of May, and there were 3 quotes that I thought stood out. The first one, quote, and this is you speaking, "Now the people who gave us the orders are trying to paint us as running amok," said Mr. Tambs, a professor of history at Arizona State University, in his first interview on the subject since leaving office. Quote, "It's insane," unquote. Next quote was, "I am terribly afraid they may now have forgotten." Giving that approval, Mr. Tambs said, quote, "These guys are trying to save their jobs." You were asked to who you were referring to, and I'm not sure the other quotes are on this, you said the rig, I believe you're talking about Mr. Abrams, the fellow in the CIA, and North. That's what you said, right? And then you finally said, "It is absolutely outrageous to fry lower-level officers who are carrying out their orders." Those are all accurate statements.
That's correct, yes,
Right.
indeed.
I'm just very interested, knowing you to be the measured kind of a fellow you are, that something had to happen over a several-month period to cause you to give that interview and make what I believe to be very accurate statements, but still difficult things to say. Tell us why that finally came about and what your personal feelings were as to what was happening to you. Did you feel you were being kind of hung out to dry?
No, the fact is that as ambassador, I am responsible and was responsible. What I find to be disconcerting, to put it mildly, is to see officers who were carrying out what they believed to be orders from their legitimate superiors now, in effect, seeing their careers sacrificed. And I'm referring specifically to the senior CIA person in Costa Rica. And you have a situation which I think is one which will eventually perhaps paralyze the government and the Foreign Service, and that is that if an officer receives an order, first of all, he's going to wonder whether it's legal and consult his lawyer. But secondly, if he fears that if he carries out an order, then his senior officer is going to cut and run if there is an investigation. And investigations, of course, are right and proper. And as I suggested to you today when the question was asked about the aircraft landing at the international airport, those orders to service it were given by me. And those officers were, in effect, carrying out orders from their legitimate superior.
But everything you did in relation to the Southern Front and all of the things involved there, too, things involved even with General Singlab, other than the agreement, which we've already discussed today, all of those things were essentially a result of directions that you got from relatively high-ranking officials in the White House, the agency, and the State Department.
That's correct, sir.
And you assumed that they had authority to give them.
Yes.
And you carried out their orders to the best of your ability.
Yes, sir.
And now that you did, and you're no longer part of the establishment, you know, you're off in Arizona teaching, so you're not part of the establishment. People are kind of suggesting in their testimony that old Tambs did it all by himself. That outrage you?
Well, it's very complimentary in a way, isn't it? Huh? Huh? At the same time, when we discussed the rig, is that I thought that they were doing a splendid job, and I was delighted to be working with them because they wanted to win.
And they ought to stand up and tell us what a splendid job they were trying to do, shouldn't they?
Well, I would. I can't speak for them, but
But you would advise that.
yes.
I won't get into depositions we have here, but I'm not going to get into some because some of them would not be seemly, to use your word, to get into here. But I will tell you, Ambassador Tambs, that when the depositions of certain people you've referred to become public as to what they specifically said was their knowledge and what they did and who they told, I think that you will probably, burn up. That's what I think.
Well,
Ms. Chams, one last question. Those private patriotic Americans, the acronym,
yes, sir. Did they have an acronym?
no, I don't know what the acronym is, but they were the private patriotic Americans, as they were referred to.
Well, PPA would be the acronym.
PPA, right. Did the private patriotic Americans, you knew, of course, who was carrying out their private patriotic activities, was the Udall Corporation.
Yes.
You knew that. Did you know who the principals in the Udall Corporation were?
No, sir, I didn't.
You did not know the principal was Mr. Hakim.
No?
Yeah. You didn't know that these private patriotic Americans were using you knew they were using a Panamanian firm,
Yes, sir.
but you were not aware of the fact that this private patriotic American construction firm owned by Mr. Hakim was registered in Panama and banked in Switzerland. You didn't know that.
No, sir.
Well,
Is Mr.
Mr.
Hakim an American?
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
He's a naturalized American. Ambassador, you've been very direct. I would not be surprised if at some point in proceedings you didn't get called back by someone, because your testimony, which I think is absolutely truthful, is in absolute conflict with other testimony this committee will have. You have no reason not to be telling the truth. You've laid it all out, and I appreciate it.
Thank you kindly, sir.
A vote is pending again in the House. It's a vote on the rule of the Mineral Leasing Act, and members will be voting. One of the members now voting is Mr. Fasell. He's one of the principal questioners. He'll be back in just a few minutes. I suggest we move forward with your senators, Senator Inouye, and let them proceed under the 5-minute rule. And then when Mr. Fasell comes back, we'll go to him.
So be it. Senator Cohen?
Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Tambs, at that meeting in September of '86 at Olmsted Air Force Base, you said there was a large group, about 30, 35 people.
Yes, sir.
And I assume Mr. Elliott Abrams was there as well?
Yes, sir.
At that meeting, did you discuss the activities of the private benefactor group?
Well, by that time, I believe they had the $100 million.
So there's no discussion made?
Well, it was referred to in the historical past, I suppose. There was, once again, sir, there was a discussion which was touched upon earlier in regards to in passing of the disposal of the assets. But that did not really come forward because Mr. North was there, as indeed was the chairman of the CIA Central American Task Force, and apparently they were having different viewpoints on regards to assets, right?
Well, I'm going to ask you about that. In September of '86, did Colonel North tell you that he was trying to get the CIA to buy the airfield as an asset, and he wanted to get $4 to $5 million?
Yes, sir. He told me that, but not at that meeting. That was earlier, maybe the 3rd or 4th of September, in his office in the old executive office building. Now, the assets included, to my understanding, the airstrip, as well as some other unidentified objects.
But there's no doubt in your mind he did talk about a purchase of the assets for $4 to $5 million.
By the agency.
By the agency?
Yes, sir.
All right.
No.
Now, who was the private benefactor who always stayed in room 310 of the local hotel?
I wish I knew.
How'd you know he always stayed in room 310?
Well, it's because that when Mr. Castillo would go to call him, he'd say, I'm going to talk to 310. And Mr. X, whoever he was, apparently had a, what you want to call, permanent reservation there or something. Right?
You weren't curious as to who 310 was?
Of course I was curious, but is the sense that he was working with the Udall Corporation, I wasn't that curious.
Something about the Udall Corporation that you didn't want to know about?
Well, that wasn't I didn't want to know about it, is that if the man wanted to remain anonymous, I thought, well, that's fine. Okay.
Would you tell us Secretary Abrams' assessment of Pastora? Do you know what it was?
No, sir, I don't.
You never had any discussions about his qualifications?
No.
Do you know whether there was a disagreement between the State Department's assessment of Pastora and the CIA's?
Well, I got that impression, but is that I can't give you anything hard on that. Is that
the question I'm really trying to ask is, was the State Department upset because that Singlab was negotiating with Pastora, or because you sent the cable?
Well, frankly, that has entered my mind in the months since then. Huh? But I don't know. You know, I don't know whether I'm being cynical or suspicious, but that thought did pass my mind, but I have nothing besides vibes, okay?
Now, who did you think Castillo was reporting to, Colonel North or Mr. Casey?
Well, it was my conviction that he was reporting to the chairman of the CIA Latin or Central American Task Force and to North. And, you know, I assumed that the chairman of the CIA Central American Task Force was passing word on to the director.
Now, when Castillo told you that President Arias was going to shut down the airstrip, you told him to pass this along to North, right?
No, I was in the United States at that time, sir. I was in Greenbrier, West Virginia. And from what Colonel North told me is that Castillo had phoned North with this information, okay? You're talking about the shutting it down?
Shutting it down.
Reorient yourself, you're in a different time.
Oh. About shutting it down?
Arias wanted the airstrip closed.
Yes, right.
And
I told Castillo to tell
North
and Udall Corporation to shut it down.
Okay, did you pass that along to the State Department? That
No.
information? Who was it who complained about the quality of the aircraft that General Secord was furnishing?
I did.
Did you witness it yourself, inspected it yourself?
No. Is that in a couple of times is that Mr. Castillo said that there was going to be a resupply fight to the armed democratic resistance.
Well, you put it mildly and called it a bunch of junk.
Well, the fact is that the planes that were supposed to do the resupply seemed to be broken down in the airfield at Ilopango most of the time.
Okay. Now, you've also said that your prior experience with NSC, you came to the conclusion that government does not work.
Yes.
You say that?
Yes, sir.
And that you said that the rig was a mechanism to make it work.
Yes.
Right? You meant the sub-rig, didn't you?
Well, yes. Right.
You don't like big committees.
No, I'm an academician. I know what they're for.
They create camels?
Yes, exactly. Right. Huh?
So the solution that you would say is have a small rig and you can get things done.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thanks very much.
But you have been not only looking at the history, but also intergovernmental operations in Central America. You're familiar, having been an ambassador with insurgencies. I'd like to ask you a professional opinion. Maybe it's out of your area. If so, fine, just tell me. The opinion is that if the Sandinista government consolidates without any internal or external opposition, do you believe that they will use that opportunity to undermine and to destabilize through insurgencies other Central American governments?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. Is that their slogan is revolution without frontiers.
Without organized opposition, obviously coming mostly from the United States of America, to frustrate that goal of undermining democratic governments in Central America, what are the chances between 1 and 10 that other Central American governments will lose their democracy and their freedom? 1 meaning absolutely remote, and 10 meaning absolutely will occur.
Well, I'd say somewhere between 9 and 9.9.
So it's almost in your mind a certainty that other Central American governments will lose their freedom. If those Central American governments lose their freedom on the same scale between 1 and 10, what would the chances of Mexico losing her freedom?
Well, Mexico, of course, is a very precarious economic situation, and there's already insurgency, as you know, in Chiapas. And if Guatemala goes, I think you could count on Mexico being next.
What would the United States be like, in your professional opinion as a historian, with a Marxist Central America and Marxist Mexico?
Well, we'd be in real trouble. You know, President Lincoln faced a hostile Mexico when the French invaded Mexico. And you recall that the United States supported the Mexican freedom fighters against the French and Austrian intervention under the Emperor Maximilian. And the leader of the Mexican freedom fighters, Benito Juarez, that's why we have Juarez across from El Paso, because that's as far as he retreated. After the end of the, shall I say, the war between secession, or the war over I mean, how can I say this in this group and not offend anybody? In the war between the states, I suppose that's correct. In 1865, then President Johnson sent 100,000 troops under General Phil Sheridan to the Texas border with Mexico, and also collected vast amounts of surplus war material, which were conveniently lost to the Mexican freedom fighters. The United States consistently has supported people's efforts to keep their own dignity and freedom. This is true in all of Spanish America. It was true in Mexico in the 1860s. It was true in Cuba. And in a sense, it is the tradition of the United States. After all, I think we tend to forget that without the aid of the Dutch and the French and the Spaniards, our Minutemen in 1776 probably would have lost to the British Empire.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My time is up.
Thank you.
Mr. Brooks?
Mr. Ambassador, while you were ambassador and really the de facto commanding general of the Southern Front, you got most of your directions from Colonel North and Thomas Castillo, and you reported back to Washington through CIA channels to the CIA, to the National Security Council. Now, my question, and what disturbs me, is I wondered who you were working for. Who did you think you were working for, the State Department or the CIA?
Well, sir, I must take exception to your assumption that I was the commander of the Southern Front. That's really not accurate. And my job,
that was the job they gave you to do, wasn't it?
Well, I had other things to do besides that, sir.
Such as?
Well, one thing is
drug interdiction or whatever.
We had that. We had commercial relations. We had a very large aid program in Costa Rica. Mm-hmm. And I'm very interested in what you would call the cultural war. So I like to talk to, student groups.
But conducting the Southern Front was a major part of your responsibility as given to you by Lieutenant Colonel North.
My instructions were not to run the Southern Front. My instructions were to open it. That's two different things.
Open it. Right. Is there a difference between opening and running? Do you open it and turn it over to somebody, or do you just tell somebody else to go do it?
Well, the only people who can win the war in Nicaragua are the Nicaraguans, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, I believe
that wasn't you.
That's not me.
I understand that.
Right.
Well, now, who did you think you were working for?
Well, did all ambassadors have a presidential commission? Ultimately, you work with the President of the United States. The line of authority, of course, is through the State Department. In this particular case, it included, as far as I'm concerned, it included the RIG, which included my direct superior in the State Department.
Elliot
Abrams. Yes.
And Bill Casey in the CIA, and Colonel North in the White House on the RIG.
Well, yes, sir.
And that's what you interpreted the chain of command to be.
Yes, on this particular issue.
And you worked for all of them.
Well, is that the Assistant Secretary of State's the chairman of that rig?
And that's who you really work for.
Yeah. Well, I really work for the Secretary of State and the President, but is that obviously you have an immediate superior, right?
And Colonel North told you what to do.
No. Is it when he spoke through Castillo, I assume, sir, that he was talking for the rig.
And they were representing who?
Well, obviously, if Elliott was the chairman, right, and the other, what's the name of that? The senior, no, the CIA, what do you call it? The chairman of the CIA Latin American Task Force was represented, as indeed was the NSC. That, on this issue, was the one, in my opinion, which was, in effect, running the show.
Well, did you think that the President supported that effort that you were working on? You having been appointed by him,
well,
working for the Secretary of State?
I have no knowledge whether the President knew or supported it. I can't tell you. I don't know.
You didn't have any confidence that those people were representing him?
I didn't have any confidence
that they were representing the President of the United States, yes, sir, and telling you what to do.
Well, you're talking about in hierarchical sense?
No, I'm talking in the sense that they told you to open up that front and get that war started down there, and you were doing that. And did you think you did that that they gave you those orders with the authority of the President, or do you think they just made them up themselves?
Well, the war was going on long before I got there, sir. I want to make that clear to you.
And the Southern Front was doing well?
Well, the Southern Front needed probably some improvement, right? But the war was going on down there. And
the war had been going on since before we were born, everywhere, somewhere.
Right. Yes, yeah, but would you repeat that question, please?
Yeah. The question is whether or not you felt that the people that gave you your instruction and your motivation to improve, accelerate the Southern Front, the rigged people, delivered by North, whether that was with the authority of the President of the United States or whether they dreamed it up themselves some night over coffee.
Well, I don't know what they would have in their coffee, sir, but that I assume that they were acting as the legally constituted superiors. That's all I can tell you. I don't believe that they were acting on their own.
Well, who would they have been acting for if they weren't acting on their own?
Well, obviously they had bosses just like I do, right? But I didn't ask them, whether they had consulted with their bosses or not. That really was. If a superior officer gives me an order, I don't ask him if he has checked it with his superior.
You make a hell of a good corporal.
But I made Buck Sergeant eventually.
That'd be hopeful.
Yeah.
But one other thing, how was the rig established? How do you think these three people came to get together to decide what you were supposed to do down there?
Well, rigs, as you well know, sir, is that, they have rigs and SIGs and IGs, all things like that, and they come and go, right?
Well, how did this one happen to come?
Well, well, I assumed it was established with the authority of the NSC.
Was an NSDD issued to create it?
I honestly don't know.
You think maybe the head of the NSC just appointed it?
I can't say, sir.
And the chairman was designated as Elliott Abrams or Schultz?
I honestly don't know. Is it that those are things which I can't tell. I can only tell what I know. What I can't tell what I don't know, and I don't know whether they went through that or not. Huh?
No further questions,
Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, Ambassador.
Yes, sir.
Over here.
Hi.
Earlier, Ambassador, you were asked a question, and I don't know if it was in the question or in your answer, but you said that Colonel North was out making speeches and raising money for the Contras. Do you now? I think we all know he was making speeches, but do you know of your own knowledge that he was raising money for the Contras?
if I recall, is that he never made a pitch. In other words, that there was always a disconnect. Huh?
So your testimony is, as far as you know, he wasn't raising money for the Contras?
No, he was making speeches favoring the freedom fighters.
All right. Now, Ambassador, last week when General Singlab was here, in my questioning of him, I had a large photograph of a 10,000-foot runway at Punta Huete in Nicaragua, a beautiful concrete, longest runway in Central America, can accommodate anything in the Soviet inventory. Right. Bear bombers, backfire bombers, it's got anti-aircraft sights, grading for fuel storage, refueling apron, and all that good stuff, aircraft revetments. Now I compare that facility with the little dirt strip that we've been raising such hell about here all day in the mountains of Costa Rica that never got finished, and I guess when a plane flew in it, it got stuck in the mud. And yes. I look at that dirt strip of maybe a third as big as this 10,000 foot concrete Punta Huete airstrip. What kind of a signal does that send to the people in Central America and to our adversaries in the Kremlin, comparing those two airstrips so close together?
Well, is that tragically it may send a signal to our friends in Central America that U.S. resolve and purpose is not there.
Well, Ambassador, you, of course, as all witnesses who come before us, are convinced that if there's one sacred thing around this place, it's the law. And bearing in mind that the Supreme Court has said in United States versus Curtis Wright that the president alone has the power to speak or listen as a representative of the nation. Now, bearing in mind the law and its sanctity before this branch of government here that we're happily engaged in, we've been concentrating on presidential usurpation, overreaching of congressional authority, the Boland Amendment in its manifest forms. I think one of the council said it forbade the government from aiding the Contra. The whole government, not just what it said, it had a penumbra that spread beyond its words to the whole government, interdicting us from helping the Contras. Now, assuming that's so, which I am the last person to assume, we've been concentrating on executive excesses, overreaching. Doesn't that cut both ways? Doesn't Congress, let's say through the Boland Amendment and other efforts, overreach and trespass on the president's prerogatives, which, as the Supreme Court, the law has told us, he alone has the power to speak? And I have in mind, and as a professor, you may want to use this in class, I have in mind a document dated March 20th, 1984, signed by 10 of the outstanding intellectual and spiritual leaders of Congress, some of whom serve with distinction on this very committee. And they wrote it to Comandante Daniel Ortega. We have been, I quote, "We have been and remain opposed to U.S. support for military action directed against the people or government of Nicaragua." So here we have 10 members of Congress, notwithstanding that the president alone has the power to speak or listen, telling the Walter Reuther with a Spanish accent, Daniel Ortega down there, that we don't agree with our country's foreign policy. Then they went on to say, we support your decision to schedule elections this year, to reduce press censorship, and to allow greater freedom of assembly for political parties. Finally, we recognize that you have taken these steps in the midst of ongoing military hostilities on the borders of Nicaragua. Then it goes on, the last paragraph is the one that I hold dear to my heart. It says, we reaffirm to you our continuing respect and friendship for the Nicaraguan people and pledge our willingness to discuss these or other matters of concern with you or officials of your government at any time. Would you say this was sort of putting the shoe on the other foot, and these distinguished members of Congress, and believe me, they're distinguished, stepping over into the president's preserve despite the law? What's your comment on that?
Well, I'm not a professor of constitutional law. I'm a professor of Latin American history, but I think it would make a great subject for a term paper.
Well, we'll revisit this from time to time during these hearings. I thank you.
Mitchell?
Is that all right?
Chairman, I'm tempted to try to inject some additional factors into the equation in Central America, but that, in addition to those suggested, but time is limited, so I'd prefer to get into another area. You said a couple of times today that it is important that government officials obey orders and that they can't all consult their lawyers. I think we all agree with that. You said government would be paralyzed if everyone in the field had to check on the legality of orders. You also, however, recognized in all of your statements that there are circumstances in which that may not be the case. You used the word immoral, I think, in one statement, and you recognize as an historian that there's a substantial body of law developed over the last half century, primarily by Americans, that there are circumstances in which government officers have a positive duty not to obey orders. And so the situation all government officers find themselves in is generally the presumption that orders are legal, but they have to also be conscious of the fact that there are circumstances in which they are not required to obey the law and indeed have a positive duty, as I said, not to obey it. And there's no clear line, there's no easy way to make that. It depends really upon the situation and the sensitivity of the individual. Would you agree with that?
Yes, well, there's no freedom outside the law.
Yes, right. And you've said several times it's important within the Constitution and the law.
Right.
And that's particularly important in a democracy which exists under the rule of law. Now, in your particular case, you were designated or appointed by the President to be ambassador to Costa Rica, his personal representative. You knew, of course, about the controversy, the widely publicized controversy involving Central America, aid to the Contras. You were aware that Congress had enacted legislation which had as its intention, wise or not, to place some restrictions upon the form of that aid. And you testified here today yet that notwithstanding that, you didn't bother to read the Boland Amendment, the law. In fact, I think you said you hadn't read it to this day. In retrospect, do you think it would have been prudent in preparation for your duty as the principal American official in Costa Rica that it would have been at least wise to have read the law that sought to govern the activities of persons like yourself?
Well, is that, Mr. Mitchell, is that I'm not a lawyer. I probably wouldn't have understood it anyway. Is that the fact is that we in the government have to rely upon legal counsel. People who...
Did you seek legal counsel from
well,
anyone?
as I stated earlier, sir, is that the assumption which we went along with is that the people who were giving the orders had sought and gotten legal counsel.
I'm not talking about a response to a particular order. I'm talking about you're going to be the President's personal representative, the ambassador to Costa Rica. One of your assigned tasks is to open up a southern military front in Nicaragua. The Congress has passed very controversial and highly publicized legislation seeking to restrict the activities of certain government officials in that effort. And in preparation for your undertaking that task, in retrospect, do you not think it would have been wise and prudent to have read the law, to have sought some counsel, have sought some guidance as to what activities may or may not have been legal, particularly in view of your repeated assertion today of the importance of obedience to the law and acting within the law and Constitution?
Well, it would have been a prudent move, but even if I had read it and gotten counsel, well, counsel should have been able to tell me, right? But is that I have difficulty, reading a contract for a refrigerator. So is that my own personal initiative would probably not have been a success. in regards to the second half of your question,
You think that's
it probably would have been a good move, but I didn't do it.
You think that's
What can I say? Huh?
Do you think the fact that people may not understand the details, laws, an excuse for not obeying the law?
No, is that tragically that does happen, but is that we had no legal counsel, no U.S. lawyer at the embassy in San Jose, right?
Finally,
And,
let me ask you, you said that the person in the field has to be able to assume that it's a legal order and it's lawful, the action being sought is lawful, and I think we all agree with that. You've also said that we have to obey the rule of law. In our democracy, who then is responsible for seeing that the orders are legal and that the actions required do comply with the law?
Well, is that I would assume, sir, with the person who gives the orders.
Well, you received an order and you passed an order along. In other words, is it your notion that when Colonel North gave you an order that it was his responsibility to see that the order was legal?
Yeah, or the rig or whatever.
Well, that's my question, the rig or whatever. I mean, if it's your position that it wasn't you who had the responsibility, the person giving you the order, could not the person above you give the same answer, that it was the person who gave him the order?
Well, yes, of course, you could go on and have all sorts of tragic things develop from that. Is that you're only too aware, is that in the field, you have to do things in many cases now.
No.
And you're stuck in effect with, it's not what are you going to do tomorrow? And it's got to be done now.
Well,
and is that if you have to make a decision or you have to carry out something that's been told to you, is that the practical aspect in that in most cases you don't have time. Something's going on, and it's is that what I fear if people begin to have carry their own legal counsels around, which might be prudent, is that the government will come to absolute grind halt.
My time is up, Ms. Tance, but I just want to make clear that neither I nor anyone has or would suggest that every person in the government has to carry his own legal counsel. But the only way that the 2 points you have made can be reconciled, the one point being that people must be able to assume the legality of the orders, but that there must be some way of determining that the orders are legal, is that responsibility for determining their legality must exist somewhere.
Yes,
and
but
the Constitution places it in the President of the United States.
Well, is it the orders we were given were not manifestly illegal?
Well, that's a whole new area of discussion. That's something that has been said many, many times by, indeed, almost invariably by persons in government who have violated the law. But that's a whole new area, and my time doesn't permit getting into it. Thank you very much, Ms. Tambs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Stokes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Tambs, let me revisit a statement that I think you made earlier today. Do I quote you correctly when you said that you saw the opening up of the southern front in Nicaragua as an extension of our mission to defend the United States against its enemies, both foreign and domestic? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I said that I took an oath to defend the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic. Correct.
See. And you saw the opening up of the southern front as a part of that oath?
In the sense that the Sandinistas, in the first sentence of the second stanza of their hymn, declare that the United States is the enemy of humanity. Mm-hmm. In other words, they have declared us an enemy, so consequently I would assume that they know what they're saying, right?
All right. Let's take that. The war in which they are involved is their own civil war, isn't it?
Well, to a great extent, as you well know, sir, it is Soviet intrusion and Cuban intrusion and the injecting of massive amounts of weaponry into Nicaragua, which is causing a great deal of this trouble.
And American intrusion?
Well, the American intrusion, as you well know, is minimal compared to what the Soviets have put in.
Whether we minimize it or not, or maximize it, it is intrusion, is it not?
You mean talking about the East-West conflict in Central America?
Well, I'm talking about in Nicaragua.
All right.
Aren't these Nicaraguans killing Nicaraguans?
Well, the
in their own
Sandinistas,
country?
as you know, sir, the Sandinistas are also, in the past, for the last number of years, have been exporting revolution to El Salvador. And we're talking about weaponry and training, and the major communication center for the Salvadorian insurgents is located right outside Managua. So, in other words, that Nicaragua has been intervening in the affairs of its neighbors, El Salvador, and partially a couple of times in Honduras. And I think that the intrusion of the Soviet Union into the Caribbean and into Central America is one of the major parts of the problem.
But let's talk about intervening for a moment. Our relationship with Nicaragua goes back to 1853, doesn't it?
Well, if you're talking about the Walker affair.
Yes.
Right.
I'm talking about the period of 1853 to 1933. How many interventions were there militarily by the United States against Nicaragua?
Well, honestly, I don't know.
Well, you're a history professor.
Yeah. I could name is that Walker was not. Well, it is true that the Democratic Convention of 1856 supported Walker, called for the annexation of Nicaragua, but that Walker was not an American official. He was a filibusterer. Huh?
Well, Ambassador, wouldn't it be an accurate statement? Wouldn't it be an accurate statement if I were to say to you, between the period 1853 to 1933, there were 12 military interventions in Nicaragua by the United States?
Well,
Wouldn't that be an accurate
if you tell me it's 12, I believe you, Mr. Stokes.
In fact, well, you're the historian, and I just want to prove my statements through you. You're the expert. In fact, from the period 1912 to 1933, we continuously occupied Nicaragua, didn't we? Period of almost 21 years.
Well, we kept a Marine Guard there at the legation. I think we were in and out. You know, one time Sandino called for a U.S. intervention,
That's right.
as you well know, right?
That's right.
And
we responded. And we responded.
Well, we responded, but the Sandinista leader at one time believed that U.S. intervention would guarantee free elections. So we can't say that it was either one part or the other which requested it, right? Is that I personally, sir, am a non-interventionist. I want you to understand that.
Sure.
Huh? And there has been U.S. intervention. But the fact is that in many cases, it was done by presidents of both parties who believed that it was necessary for the United States. Now, they may have been mistaken, but nevertheless, it has been U.S. policy to defend ourselves in the Caribbean from foreign intrusion since Thomas Jefferson's large plan of 1808, as you know better than I do, right?
I agree fully with you, but the bottom line is that in terms of military interventions as it relates to the United States and Nicaragua, it is the United States that has militarily intervened in Nicaragua.
Yes, well, may I say, sir, that I do not favor U.S. military intervention in Nicaragua. I believe that the Nicaraguans should do the fighting if they want to free Nicaragua.
Right.
And tragically, is that I'm afraid that we're increasingly faced with the choice between sending men or money. And I'd rather send money. Huh?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, I have just a few questions. Did Secretary Schultz know about the Southern Front?
Honestly, I don't know, sir.
At the time, were you proceeding on the assumption that he did know about it? I mean, what was your own thinking about whether the Secretary of State knew about the Southern Front?
My assumption, but that's not knowledge, was that he probably did, but is that I don't honestly know.
And why did you make that assumption? Because you just thought in the reasonable course of work that Abrams would report to the Secretary?
Yeah. Yes.
You did brief Poindexter about the Southern Front.
Yes, he knew about it when he came down.
He already knew about it?
Oh, sure.
And then you briefed him on it, I take it?
Well, we just brought him up to date. That was either in December, sir, of late December of '85 or very early January '86.
But you never had occasion to talk to the Secretary of State about it,
No,
or the
sir.
Deputy Secretary?
No, sir.
Did you go above Abrams in the State Department in communicating with anyone about the Southern Front?
No, sir.
So to the extent that it was known above Abrams, and you assume that it was because Abrams would have told them, is that correct?
Exactly, yeah.
Now, when you communicated back channel to Abrams, were you assuming that those cables would be seen by the Secretary?
Well, my assumption was that the Assistant Secretary would tell the Secretary. That's all I can tell you. Huh?
Would you be surprised if you learned that the Secretary had been kept in the dark about the Southern Front?
I don't know really how to answer that, because I don't know. Huh? I don't know one way or the other. You know, I would be uncomfortable if that's a fact. Huh?
Earlier, there was some questioning about the amount of time you put in on the Southern Front.
Yes, sir.
But sometimes it's quality, not quantity, that counts. Do you think Costa Rica would have given permission for that airfield if you had not personally interceded with officials of that government?
Well, they wanted it for their own good reasons, as I tried to point out to you earlier, and that is specifically as a reinforcement and resupply if there was a Nicaraguan invasion. There was also a tangential reason, is that they wanted the Nicaraguan democratic resistance out of Costa Rica. I don't blame them. And the only way you could get them out was to supply them inside Nicaragua. Additionally, is that Point West, or Santa Elena, it was located very close to the Civil Guard training camp at Murciélago. And the airfield there is too short. It's longer now, but a couple of aircraft, it's a landing you don't want to take unless you're in the state of grace. It's one of those.
Well,
So it's too short, and a number of aircraft went off the end. And there was part of the plan was to construct a road from Santa Elena on up to Murciélago so they could use that as a strip.
I'm not suggesting that you necessarily imposed something on them that they didn't want, but you were the catalyst that obtained the permission for the airstrip to be built there, were you not?
I suppose that's a fair statement.
I mean, if you hadn't gone to them as the U.S. ambassador and sought to have this strip built, it probably would never have happened.
Well, I don't know, but I can't say. There's always another guy who can do it just as well.
Well,
Not
but
better,
you were the catalytic agent in this instance that went from having no airstrip there to getting permission to have an airstrip put there, were you not?
Well, it could have been done, privately and covertly. I'm not. Is that I think you're being too kind to me. Is that?
Did the owner of the land come to you to see whether this ought to be done, or to get some judgment from you about proceeding with it?
The owner of the land is essentially an innocent, in the sense that, and he came to me and I was asked.
There's sometimes a sense in which
Yes.
we all think we're innocent
Right.
as we proceed through this matter. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
And he asked me if the Udall Corporation were, in effect, people who would honor an agreement. That is, and I said, as far as I know, they are. But that's nothing unusual in the sense that we have, if we have some idea that some U.S. manufacturing firm is going into business with a Costa Rican partner, that they will do the same thing. But what you asked, sir, is correct. Yes, he did come to me and ask me.
At the time you told him that, what did you know about the Udall Corporation? At the time that you gave it a stamp of approval in terms of his going ahead, what did you know about the Udall Corporation?
Well, what I knew about them was limited, but I was assured that, through Mr. Castillo, that they were solvent and they could make their bills and they would pay their debts.
So your vetting of the Udall Corporation to the owner of the land was based on Castillo telling you that it was an okay corporation?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Boland.
Sorry.
Your service at the National Security Council,
Yes, sir.
and I understand you served there for how many months?
I was there about 9 or 10 months, sir, as a consultant.
And in your combining that with your 2 ambassadorships, I would assume that you observed the operations of a number of rigs?
Yes.
Now, what was your understanding of the role of the agency heads whose organizations were represented on that rig, or on any rig?
Well,
what was the role of the Secretary of State, the Director of the CIA, and the National Security Advisor were really the agency heads of the representatives on the rig that we're talking about here?
What was their role? Well, I tried to suggest earlier, sir, that the working rig was composed of the 3 individuals who I have named, okay? And most rigs that I ever sat on or knew about tended to be at that sort of a level. And it was only when there was, vast, in a sense, when you look at the United States government, it's like a group of feuding fiefdoms or something, right? And they try and work things out through committees or rigs. And it was my impression in the past that it was only when it was impossible to come to an agreement at a lower level that things were escalated to a higher level.
Rigs can be a very powerful instrument, can they not, in the instrumentation of policy?
Oh, yes.
Now, would it have been proper, given your understanding of the procedure, and you understood it, obviously, for the restricted interagency group to issue orders on its own, or should it have taken orders from down through the chain of command from the agency heads?
Well, obviously one would assume that they were carrying out orders from their superiors.
Yeah, I think you've already testified that you did not know whether or not the Secretary of State was familiar with opening the second front, and I can understand that. You testified also that before you left for Central America in July of 1985, Oliver North told you that one of your responsibilities was to establish a southern front for the Contras. When you were at the Latin American section of NSC as a staff member of the NSC, were new ambassadors to countries in the region ever given specific policy assignments by NSC staff members?
Well, when I was on the NSC, I was the 3rd man in Latin America, right? They had Roger Fontaine was the top man, another chap, the 2nd man, and they were the ones who talked to outgoing ambassadors. So I can't really give you an honest answer in that.
Would you be familiar with whether or not assignments for ambassadors or their respective duties are ordinarily coordinated with the State Department?
You're talking about specific missions when in country? Yeah, I think that's, although very frankly, there seemed on several occasions to be a difference of opinion between the NSC and the State Department.
Incidentally, I anticipated your opinion and your answer to the question that was asked a little while ago. And the question of the legality of any wall might very well be established in some other form. It might very well be established here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, I'm right next door over here.
Okay.
I want to just have a very brief dialogue about this airstrip we've been slopping through all afternoon, I guess, down there in Costa Rica. I'm still not clear on just whose idea this airstrip was. Whose was it?
Well, is that I don't honestly know who could take either credit or blame for that. Okay?
I guess it'd be both.
Ambiguous here, right? Is that the question, as I tried to suggest to you earlier, was how do you supply? You only have three ways of doing it. You have land, you have sea, or you have air. Okay? The land supplies was out for many good reasons, right? Maritime supplies were very dubious. So as far as I recall, right, is the original suggestion came from the private patriotic Americans.
Was this a discussion in which you participated?
No.
This airstrip was not your idea, personally, or your suggestion?
No, it was not. Huh?
And you first heard about it or first recall it being brought to your attention through the private benefactors or through...
No, that I didn't have any contact with the private benefactors.
Well, how did you first learn about the airstrip?
Well, is that if I recall correctly, it was Mr. Castillo, right?
He's the one who first mentioned it to you?
Yes, right.
The idea of the airstrip?
Right.
And you had not heard anything about it before, not discussed the concept, not been involved with it in any way before he brought it up?
Well, is that if I recall, when I, as I suggested to you earlier, sir, there were only three ways to do it.
I understand that, but had you discussed the ways of doing it before the idea of the strip came up? I mean, was that something that you had discussed either with Mr. Castillo or with the private benefactors or with Mr. North? Or
no, I never discussed it with the private benefactors, and if I recall, it was Don Tomas Castillo who suggested it to us. Apparently, he had been in contact with the private benefactors.
But at some point prior to that time, you did discuss with Mr. Castillo or someone the ways of doing this, whether the airstrip was involved or not, that the problems you outlined, you just did one, two, three. There were three ways of doing it. The idea that we needed to do it or we were going to do it or the private benefactors might do it, all of that was sort of batted around somewhere in your presence with you involved either with Mr. Castillo or somebody prior to the time the airstrip idea ever came up. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
You don't recall if anybody else was involved in that discussion besides Mr. Castillo?
No.
There might have been?
There might have been, yes.
Was this, when would this roughly have been? I'm confused by the whole day we've been through. So many things we're about to conclude.
It would be, I suppose, very, very late July 1985. The first weeks of August of 1985.
Well, there have been quite a number of comments that I've seen from time to time as the newspapers are reported, the Tower Commission's reported, and I've read depositions and so on that have been critical of ever going ahead with this in the sense that it was not practical from a physical standpoint. You couldn't get gasoline or oil or fuel in there. You had problems with the soil. You had all kinds of problems with this thing. Did that get discussed at any point before it got to the end of the road, so to speak, and everybody was obviously not going to finish it?
Well, I don't know, because certainly I didn't discuss the soil conditions or any of that sort of stuff.
You never got involved with it?
No.
You never paid attention to it?
No.
Were you aware at some point while this was going on or before it was terminated that it was a really big problem, that it was a practical matter unrelated to any of the issues other than that? Just a pure practical problem?
Are you saying did it become a big problem? The answer is yes. Huh?
Yeah, but it was brought to your attention that it was a problem to build it physically and to use it if it were to be used.
Well, I frankly don't. If there was a problem building it, I don't know why.
Okay, let me ask you one last question. Were you aware that Mr. Castillo had a KL-43 device?
Is that they asked me that when I gave my deposition, right? And in April, right? And at that time, is that I think that he told me about it, right? But I would not swear that he did.
All right.
But let's assume that he did. Okay?
All right.
All right.
You don't recall for sure, but you thought he did. Is
Yeah.
that what you're saying
Yeah,
to us?
that's what I'm telling you, right.
And one last point I'd like to make, or just maybe a question to you. After all of this discussion about all these laws and being here so long, Ambassador Tambs, wouldn't it be a lot easier on ambassadors like yourself if Congress wrote simpler, more straightforward laws? I will leave that.
I will leave that to you gentlemen.
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, I understand that you and your wife will be expecting very shortly.
Yes, sir.
And we want to say to you that we wish you and her the very best. We thank you for your testimony. We understand that it was given at considerable personal inconvenience to you because of the family situation, and so we are indeed grateful to you for your appearance.
Thank you kindly, sir.
And you are excused. Without objection, we will enter into the record exhibits FIR 1 through 6 and LAT 1 through 6. The joint hearing will resume at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning with the CIA agent. That will be an executive session. It'll be in room 2141, and members are asked to enter through the door 2140. That's on this floor of the Rayburn building. The two select committees stand in recess then until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.